King Arthur is one of the most beloved figures in all of storytelling. For over 1,000 years, people around the world have shared tales of this legendary king. He represents courage, honour, and the dream of a better world. His story has been told in countless books, films, and songs, and tonight we will explore his entire journey together, from the very beginning to the very end. Let us begin our story not with Arthur himself, but with the world that needed him. To truly understand why Arthur became such an important figure, we must first understand the land he was born into. We must travel back in time to an age of darkness and uncertainty when the great Roman Empire had finally released its grip on the island of Britain. For nearly 400 years, the Romans had ruled Britain. They had built magnificent roads that stretched across the land like stone ribbons. They had constructed mighty walls to keep out invaders from the north. They had established cities with heated baths, grand temples, and bustling marketplaces. Under Roman rule, Britain had known a certain kind of order. There were laws. There were soldiers to enforce those laws. There was trade and commerce, and all the comforts that came with being part of a vast and powerful empire. But empires, like all things, do not last forever. By the early 5th century, Rome itself was in trouble. Barbarian tribes pressed against its borders from every direction. The once mighty legions were stretched thin, trying to defend territories that spanned from the deserts of Africa to the forests of Germania. And so, around the year 410, the Roman Emperor Honorius sent a letter to the people of Britain. In this letter, he told them something that must have filled their hearts with dread. He told them that Rome could no longer protect them. They would have to defend themselves. Imagine, if you will, what this must have felt like. For generations, the people of Britain had relied on Roman soldiers to keep them safe. Roman engineers had built their roads and aqueducts. Roman administrators had organised their towns and collected their taxes. And now, suddenly, all of that was gone. The legions marched away, back across the sea to defend the heart of the empire. And Britain was left alone. At first, things may not have seemed so different. The roads were still there. The cities still stood. But without the Roman army to patrol the coastlines and man the forts, Britain became vulnerable. And there were many who saw this vulnerability as an opportunity. From across the cold grey waters of the North Sea came ships. These were not trading vessels laden with goods. These were warships, long and sleek, with carved prows that cut through the waves like knives. And in these ships sat warriors from the lands we now call Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. The Romans had called these people by many names. Some were Angles, some were Saxons, some were Jutes, but to the frightened people of Britain, they were all the same. They were invaders. They were conquerors. They were a force of destruction that would change Britain forever. The Saxon raids began as quick strikes along the coast. Warriors would land on the beaches, burn a village, take whatever they could carry, and sail away before any defence could be organised. But as the years passed and the Saxons realised how weak Britain had become, these raids grew bolder. Instead of simply raiding and leaving, the Saxons began to stay. They built settlements. They brought their families. They claimed the land as their own. The native Britons fought back, of course. They were not a people who would simply surrender their homes without resistance. But they faced a terrible problem. Under Roman rule, the Britons had relied on the legions for military protection. They had not maintained their own warrior traditions in the same way their ancestors once had. And the Saxons were fierce fighters, hardened by lives of warfare and raiding. Battle by battle, year by year, the Saxons pushed deeper into Britain. The old Roman cities began to crumble. Without Roman engineers to maintain them, the great stone buildings fell into disrepair. Roofs collapsed. Walls tumbled down. The heated baths grew cold and silent. The marketplaces emptied. People fled from the cities into the countryside, seeking safety in remote villages and hill forts. The learning and literacy that the Romans had brought began to fade. Fewer and fewer people could read or write. The knowledge of how to build in stone, how to create fine pottery, how to work metal in the Roman fashion, all of this began to be forgotten. Historians sometimes call this period the Dark Ages, and it is easy to understand why. It was a time when the light of civilization seemed to be flickering out. It was a time of fear and violence and uncertainty. Petty kings and warlords carved out small territories for themselves, fighting constantly with their neighbours. There was no unity. There was no central authority. There was only chaos. And yet, in the midst of this darkness, there were those who remembered. There were those who kept alive the dream of a united Britain, a Britain at peace, a Britain ruled by justice rather than by the sword of whoever happened to be strongest. These dreamers looked back at the Roman times not as a period of foreign occupation, but as a golden age of order and prosperity, and they looked forward, hoping that someday someone would arise who could bring that golden age back. It is in this context that we must understand the story of King Arthur. He was not simply a hero who appeared out of nowhere. He was an answer to a desperate need. He was the hope of a people who had nearly lost all hope. He was the light that would shine in the darkness. The legends tell us that before Arthur, there were other kings who tried to unite Britain. One of the most important of these was a man named Vortigern. Now, Vortigern is not remembered kindly in the old stories. He is often portrayed as a villain, a man whose foolish decisions brought disaster upon his people. But to understand him, we must try to see the world through his eyes. Vortigern rose to power in the chaos that followed the Roman withdrawal. He was clever and ambitious, and he managed to make himself the High King of Britain, ruling over the other petty kings. But he faced the same problem that all the British leaders faced. The Saxons kept coming, wave after wave, and his forces were not strong enough to stop them. So Vortigern made a decision that would haunt his legacy forever. He invited Saxon warriors to come to Britain, not as enemies, but as allies. He offered them land and treasure in exchange for their help in fighting against other invaders, particularly the Picts from the north. The Saxon leaders, Hengist and Horsa, accepted his offer. They brought their warriors to Britain and fought alongside Vortigern's forces. For a time, this arrangement seemed to work. The Picts were driven back. Vortigern's position was secure. But he had invited wolves into the sheepfold. The Saxons saw how rich and fertile Britain was. They saw how weak and divided the Britons were, and they wanted more than the small territories Vortigern had given them. They wanted everything. The alliance fell apart. Hengist and Horsa turned against Vortigern. According to some versions of the legend, they invited the British nobles to a great feast, a celebration of peace and friendship. But it was a trap. At a signal from Hengist, the Saxons drew hidden knives and slaughtered the unarmed Britons. This treacherous massacre became known as the Night of the Long Knives, and it left Britain more vulnerable than ever. Vortigern fled. His power was broken, his reputation was destroyed. He had tried to save Britain through cunning and compromise, and he had only made things worse. The people cursed his name. They blamed him for all their suffering, and they waited desperately for someone better to take his place. It is here that the great wizard Merlin first enters our story. The legends tell us that Vortigern, fleeing from his enemies, tried to build a great fortress in the mountains of Wales. But no matter how many times his workers built the walls, they would collapse during the night. Vortigern's advisors told him that to make the fortress stand, he would need to find a child born without a father, and sacrifice that child, sprinkling the blood upon the foundation stones. Vortigern's men searched throughout the land, and eventually they found a young boy who was said to have no human father. This boy was Merlin. He was brought before Vortigern, destined for sacrifice, But Merlin was no ordinary child. He possessed powers of prophecy and magic that far exceeded anything the king's advisors had ever seen. Instead of meekly accepting his fate, Merlin challenged the king's wise men. He told them that the real reason the fortress kept collapsing was that it was built over an underground pool, and in that pool lived two dragons, one white and one red. The dragons fought each other constantly, and their struggles shook the earth and brought down the walls. Vortigern ordered his men to dig, and sure enough, they found the pool and the dragons, just as Merlin had said. The two great beasts emerged and began to fight before the astonished eyes of the king and his court. The white dragon and the red dragon tore at each other with claws and teeth, breathing fire, roaring with fury. Merlin explained the meaning of this vision. The red dragon, he said, represented the Britons. The white dragon represented the Saxons. Their battle foretold the long struggle that would consume the land. For a time, the white dragon would have the upper hand. The Saxons would conquer much of Britain. But eventually, the red dragon would prevail. A great king would arise, a king who would drive back the Saxons and unite the Britons once more. This prophecy gave hope to the desperate people of Britain. Somewhere out there, they believed, was a future king who would save them. They did not know his name yet. They did not know when he would come, but they believed that he was coming, and that belief kept them going through the darkest years. Vortigern himself did not live to see this prophecy fulfilled. The legends tell us that he died in his fortress, consumed by fire, a fitting end for a king who had brought such destruction upon his people. With his death, the way was cleared for new leaders to arise, and so we come to the father of Arthur, a man named Uther Pendragon. But that is a story for our next chapter. For now, let us simply rest in this moment, in this dark and troubled time before the dawn. Let us feel the fear and the hope that filled the hearts of the Britons as they waited for their promised king. The land was broken, the people were scattered, the old ways were fading, but deep in the hearts of those who remembered, there burned a flame that would not go out. It was the flame of hope. It was the dream of Arthur. And soon, very soon, that dream would become reality. The night was darkest just before the dawn, and the dawn was coming. Now we turn our attention to the man who would become Arthur's father. His name was Uther, and he was called Pendragon, which means chief dragon or head dragon in the old British tongue. This title marked him as the High King, the ruler above all other rulers, the man who held the dream of a united Britain in his hands. Uther was the son of King Constantine, a noble ruler who had tried to bring order to the chaos of post-Roman Britain. Constantine had two sons besides Uther. The eldest was named Constans, and the second was named Aurelius Ambrosius. These three brothers would all play important roles in the history of Britain, though their fates would be very different. When Constantine died, his eldest son Constans became king. But Constans was a weak ruler, easily manipulated by those around him. The treacherous Vortigern, whom we met in our last chapter, saw an opportunity. He wormed his way into the young king's confidence, becoming his closest adviser, and then when the moment was right, Vortigern arranged for Constans to be murdered. He blamed the killing on others and seized the throne for himself. The two younger brothers, Aurelius Ambrosius and Uther, were just children when this happened. Loyal nobles who feared for their safety smuggled them out of Britain and across the sea to the kingdom of Brittany, in what is now France. There in exile, the two princes grew to manhood. They never forgot their homeland. They never forgot what Vortigern had done to their brother, and they never stopped planning their return. Years passed. In Britain, Vortigern's reign brought disaster after disaster. The Saxons grew stronger. The Britons grew weaker. And all the while, across the sea, Aurelius Ambrosius and Uther were gathering their strength. They were building an army, they were making alliances, they were preparing to reclaim their birthright. Finally the day came. Aurelius Ambrosius and Uther sailed back to Britain at the head of a great host. The people, who had suffered so much under Vortigern and the Saxons, rallied to their banner. Battle after battle, the brothers pushed forward. Vortigern's forces crumbled before them. At last, as we mentioned before, Vortigern met his end, trapped in his fortress and consumed by flames. Aurelius Ambrosius became the new High King of Britain. He was a wise and capable ruler, and under his leadership the Britons began to push back against the Saxons. He rebuilt churches that had been destroyed. He restored order to the land. He gave the people hope that the dark times might finally be ending. But Aurelius Ambrosius did not live long enough to complete his work. The Saxons, desperate to stop him, sent an assassin. This killer disguised himself as a doctor and gained access to the king while he lay sick with an illness. He gave Aurelius Ambrosius poison instead of medicine, and the great king died. And so Uther Pendragon became king. He was a mighty warrior, fierce and proud, with a temper as hot as dragon fire. He swore vengeance for his brother's death, and he pursued the Saxons with relentless fury. Under his leadership, the Britons won great victories. The Saxon advance was halted. For a time it seemed that the tide had truly turned. It was during this time of triumph that Uther made a decision that would change everything. He fell in love. Her name was Igraine, and she was considered the most beautiful woman in all of Britain. She had hair as dark as a raven's wing, and eyes that sparkled like stars reflected in still water. Her voice was soft and musical, and her grace was legendary. Every man who saw her was captivated by her beauty. But Igraine was not free to love Uther. She was already married to a powerful duke named Gorlois, the Duke of Cornwall. Gorlois was one of Uther's most loyal and important allies. He had fought beside Uther in many battles. He had helped him win the crown, and he loved his wife with all his heart. Uther tried to ignore his feelings for Igraine. He knew that pursuing her would be wrong. He knew that it would betray his friend and ally. But love, especially the kind of overwhelming, all-consuming love that Uther felt, does not listen to reason. The more he tried to forget Igraine, the more he thought about her. She haunted his dreams. She filled his every waking thought. The crisis came at a great feast that Uther held to celebrate his victories. He invited all the nobles of Britain, including Gorlois and Igraine. When Uther saw Igraine at the feast, he could not hide his feelings. He stared at her constantly. He showered her with attention and compliments. He ignored all the other guests, having eyes only for her. Gorlois was not blind. He saw how the king looked at his wife. He saw the danger that was brewing. And so, without asking the king's permission, he took Igraine and left the feast. He hurried back to Cornwall and prepared for the worst. Uther was furious. How dare Gorlois leave without permission? How dare he take Igraine away? In his anger and his obsession, Uther convinced himself that Gorlois had committed treason by leaving the feast. He gathered his army and marched on Cornwall. Gorlois knew he could not defeat the king in open battle. So he sent Igraine to the castle of Tintagel, a fortress built on a rocky peninsula that jutted out into the sea. Tintagel was nearly impregnable. It could only be reached by a narrow bridge of land, and a handful of defenders could hold it against an army. Igraine would be safe there. Then Gorlois himself took his soldiers to another castle and prepared to resist the king's siege. Uther's army surrounded Gorlois' castle, but the king's mind was not on the siege. All he could think about was Igraine, so close and yet so far, locked away in Tintagel. He grew sick with longing. He could not eat. He could not sleep. His officers worried that he was losing his mind. It was then that Merlin came to him. The great wizard had been watching these events unfold. He knew things that no ordinary man could know. He saw the threads of fate weaving together, forming a pattern that would shape the future of Britain. And he knew that from this tangled situation, something wonderful could emerge if it was handled correctly. Merlin came to Uther in the night and made him an offer. He said that he could use his magic to help Uther reach Igraine. He could transform Uther's appearance, making him look exactly like Gorlois. In this disguise, Uther could enter Tintagel, and no one would know that he was not the Duke. But Merlin's help came with a price. He told Uther that if a child was conceived from this union, that child must be given to Merlin. The wizard would raise the child in secret, away from the court, away from the dangers of politics and war. Uther, consumed by his desire, agreed to the bargain without fully understanding what he was promising. That very night, Merlin worked his magic. He transformed Uther into the perfect likeness of Gorlois. Even Uther's closest companions were changed, taking on the appearances of Gorlois' knights. Together, they rode to Tintagel. The guards at the gate saw their lord approaching, and opened the doors without question. Igraine, waiting anxiously for news of her husband, saw what she believed to be Gorlois walking toward her. She welcomed him with relief and joy, never suspecting the truth. And so Uther spent the night with Igraine, and on that night Arthur was conceived. But fate had more twists in store. That same night, while Uther was with Igraine, his army launched an attack on the castle where the real Gorlois was hiding. The Duke led a desperate sortie against the besiegers and was killed in the fighting. He died at almost the exact moment that Uther was with his wife. When morning came, messengers arrived at Tintagel with the news of Gorlois' death. Igraine was confused and frightened. How could her husband be dead when she had spent the night with him? She looked at the man beside her and watched in horror as Merlin's magic faded and Uther's true face was revealed. We can only imagine what Igraine felt in that moment: betrayal, confusion, grief for her dead husband, fear of what the future might hold. But Igraine was a practical woman as well as a proud one. She was now a widow, alone and vulnerable, with a powerful king who was obsessed with her. She had to think of her survival and the survival of her children. Uther, for his part, moved quickly to secure the situation. He announced that he would marry Igraine, making her his queen. This would legitimize their union and protect her honour as much as possible. Igraine agreed, whether out of genuine feeling, practical necessity, or simply because she had no other choice. The legends do not say. And so Uther Pendragon and Igraine were married. The kingdom celebrated, though whispers and rumours spread about the strange circumstances of Gorlois' death and the hasty wedding that followed. Igraine brought her daughters from her first marriage to court, including a girl named Morgan, who would later become the famous Morgan le Fay, and in her womb she carried the child who would become the greatest king Britain had ever known. 9 months later, Igraine gave birth to a son. He was a healthy, strong baby with bright eyes that seemed to hold a wisdom beyond his years. Uther and Igraine named him Arthur, but Uther had made a promise to Merlin, and the wizard came to collect. On the night of Arthur's birth, Merlin appeared at the castle. He reminded Uther of their bargain. The child must be given to him. Uther's heart broke at the thought of giving up his son. He had waited so long for an heir. He had done terrible things to be with Igraine, and now he had to surrender the fruit of all that struggle and sin. But a promise to Merlin was not something that could be broken lightly. The wizard's power was too great, and his knowledge of Uther's secrets was too dangerous. With tears in his eyes, Uther handed the baby Arthur to Merlin. The wizard wrapped the child in a cloak and carried him away into the night. Igraine wept. Uther raged, but there was nothing they could do. Arthur was gone. Merlin took the baby to a knight named Sir Ector, a good and honourable man who lived far from the court. Sir Ector had no idea who the baby really was. Merlin simply told him that the child needed a home and asked him to raise the boy as his own. Sir Ector, trusting Merlin, agreed. And so Arthur grew up not as a prince in a palace, but as the foster son of a country knight. He had no idea of his true parentage. He did not know that royal blood flowed in his veins. He was simply Arthur, a boy like any other, learning to ride and hunt and serve as a squire. Meanwhile, back at the court, Uther Pendragon's reign continued, but it was shadowed by sorrow. He missed his son terribly. He grew older and more tired. The wars against the Saxons dragged on, neither side able to achieve a decisive victory, and then after several years, Uther fell ill. Some say he was poisoned, just as his brother had been. Others say it was simply a sickness, that his worn-out body could not fight. Whatever the cause, Uther Pendragon lay dying. He had no acknowledged heir. The nobles were already beginning to scheme and plot, each one hoping to seize the throne for himself. Merlin came to the dying king one last time. He told Uther to declare publicly that his son would succeed him. Uther, with his last strength, made this declaration. He said that his true-born son would be the next king of Britain. Then he closed his eyes and died. But who was this son? Where was he? No one at the court knew. Uther had never told anyone about the bargain with Merlin, or where the child had been taken. As far as the nobles knew, Uther had died without an heir, and so Britain was plunged back into chaos. The petty kings and ambitious lords began to fight among themselves, each one claiming the right to rule. The Saxons, seeing the Britons divided once again, renewed their attacks with fresh vigour. All the gains that Uther had made were in danger of being lost. The people despaired. They had lost their king, and there was no one to take his place. The dream of a united Britain seemed to be dying. But far away, in the quiet countryside, a young boy was growing up. He did not know it yet, but he was the answer to all their prayers. He was the son of Uther Pendragon. He was the once and future king. His name was Arthur, and his time was coming. Let us now follow the young Arthur as he grows from a baby into a boy, and from a boy into a young man. These were quiet years, hidden years, years that the great chronicles barely mention. But they were important years nonetheless, for they shaped the character of the king that Arthur would become. Sir Ector was a kind and honourable guardian. He raised Arthur alongside his own son, a boy named Kay, who was a few years older than Arthur. The two boys grew up as brothers, playing together, learning together, sometimes fighting as brothers do, but always caring for each other in the end. Sir Ector's estate was not grand, but it was comfortable. There were fields and forests, horses and hounds, servants and tenants who worked the land. Arthur learned all the things that a young nobleman of that time would learn. He learned to ride a horse, sitting tall in the saddle and controlling his mount with subtle movements of his hands and legs. He learned to hunt, tracking deer through the forest and bringing down birds with his bow. He learned to fight with sword and shield, practicing for hours until his arms ached and his hands were blistered. But Arthur also learned gentler things. He learned courtesy and kindness, how to treat others with respect regardless of their station. He learned loyalty, the sacred bond between a knight and those he served. He learned justice, the importance of treating people fairly and protecting the weak from the strong. These lessons came not from books, for Arthur had little formal education, but from the example of Sir Ector and from his own good heart. Kay, the older brother, was being trained to become a knight. This was his birthright as Sir Ector's true son. Arthur, as a foster child of unknown parentage, could not expect such an honour. The best he could hope for was to become Kay's squire, serving the knight and perhaps, if he proved himself worthy, eventually being granted knighthood himself. Arthur did not complain about this situation. He did not know that he deserved anything more. He was grateful to Sir Ector for taking him in and giving him a home. He loved Kay as a brother, even though Kay could sometimes be arrogant and demanding. He was content with his lot in life, or at least he tried to be. But sometimes, in quiet moments, Arthur felt a strange stirring in his heart. He would look up at the stars and feel as though they were calling to him. He would dream vivid dreams of battles and glory, of a shining city on a hill, of people cheering his name. He did not understand these feelings. He told himself they were just foolish fantasies, the daydreams of a boy who read too many stories about heroes. But the feelings never went away. Merlin watched over Arthur from afar during these years. The wizard had not abandoned the boy he had taken from Uther. He visited Sir Ector from time to time, always in disguise, checking on Arthur's progress. He was pleased with what he saw. The boy was growing up strong and good, with a pure heart and a noble spirit. He would be ready when the time came. And then when Arthur was about 15 years old, the time came. It happened like this. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest religious authority in Britain, grew tired of the chaos and warfare that had plagued the land since Uther's death. He prayed for guidance, asking God to show the people who should be their rightful king, and then perhaps inspired by divine will, or perhaps guided by Merlin's subtle magic, the Archbishop announced that a great gathering would be held in London on Christmas Day. All the nobles and knights of Britain were summoned to attend. There God would reveal who should be king. When the nobles arrived in London, they found something miraculous waiting for them. In the churchyard of the greatest church in the city, a wonder had appeared overnight. There was a great stone, as large as an altar, and thrust into this stone was a sword. The sword was beautiful, its blade gleaming like silver, its hilt wrapped in gold and studded with precious gems. And on the stone words were written in letters of gold. The words said, "Whoso pulleth out this sword from this stone is the rightful born king of all Britain." You can imagine the excitement this caused. Every noble, every knight, every ambitious lord rushed to try his hand at the sword. They pushed and shoved, each one certain that he would be the one to pull it free. But no matter how hard they tried, no matter how strong they were, no one could move the sword even a fraction of an inch. It was stuck fast in the stone, as though it had grown there. Days passed. The Archbishop declared that a great tournament would be held on New Year's Day, and that the nobles should keep trying to pull the sword in the meantime. Knights came from all over Britain to try their luck, but none succeeded. The sword remained in the stone, waiting. Sir Ector travelled to London for the tournament, bringing Kay and Arthur with him. Kay had recently been knighted, and this would be his first tournament as a full knight. He was excited and nervous, eager to prove himself. Arthur came along as Kay's squire, responsible for carrying his equipment and helping him prepare for his bouts. On the morning of the tournament, as they were riding toward the tournament grounds, Kay suddenly realized that he had forgotten his sword. He had left it at the inn where they were staying. Without a sword, he could not compete. He turned to Arthur in a panic and asked him to ride back and fetch it. Arthur, always eager to help his brother, turned his horse and galloped back toward the inn. But when he arrived, he found the inn locked and empty. Everyone had gone to the tournament. Arthur knocked and called, but no one answered. The sword was inside, and he could not reach it. Arthur was distressed. He could not bear to disappoint Kay. His brother was counting on him. There had to be another sword somewhere, something he could bring back so that Kay could compete. And then Arthur remembered the sword in the stone. He had seen it when they arrived in London, though he had not paid much attention to it. He knew that many great knights had tried to pull it out and failed, but surely, he thought, no one would mind if he just borrowed it for the tournament. He would bring it right back afterward. Arthur rode to the churchyard. The area was deserted. Everyone was at the tournament. The great stone sat silent and still, the sword gleaming in the winter sunlight. Arthur dismounted and walked up to the stone. He did not think about the words written there. He did not consider what it might mean if he succeeded where so many others had failed. He simply reached out, wrapped his hand around the hilt, and pulled. The sword slid out of the stone as easily as a knife from butter. Arthur stared at it in amazement. It was the most beautiful sword he had ever seen, perfectly balanced, light as a feather in his hand. He did not understand what had just happened, but he did not have time to think about it. Kay needed a sword. Arthur mounted his horse and rode back to the tournament. When Arthur found Kay and presented him with the sword, Kay's eyes went wide. He recognized it immediately. Everyone in Britain knew about the sword in the stone. Kay's mind raced. If he claimed that he had pulled the sword from the stone, he would become king. Kay took the sword and hurried to find Sir Ector. He showed his father the blade and said, "Look, father, I have the sword from the stone. I must be the rightful king." Sir Ector was a wise man. He looked at his son carefully and asked, "How did you get this sword?" Kay hesitated. Under his father's steady gaze, he could not maintain the lie. He admitted that Arthur had given it to him. Sir Ector turned to Arthur and asked, "And how did you get it, boy?" Arthur explained what had happened. He had gone back for Kay's sword, found the inn locked, remembered the sword in the churchyard, and simply pulled it out. He had not thought it would be difficult. He had not realized it was supposed to be impossible. Sir Ector listened to this explanation with growing wonder. He told Arthur to come with him, and he led both boys back to the churchyard. A small crowd had gathered there, people who had wandered away from the tournament to try their luck with the sword once more. Sir Ector pushed through the crowd and stood before the stone. He told Arthur to put the sword back. Arthur, confused but obedient, slid the blade back into the stone. It sank in smoothly, as though the stone were made of water. "Now," said Sir Ector, "pull it out again." Arthur reached out and pulled the sword free once more. It came out just as easily as before. The crowd gasped. People began to shout and point. Word spread like wildfire through the tournament grounds. A boy had pulled the sword from the stone. A boy no one had ever heard of. A boy who was not even a knight. Sir Ector fell to his knees before Arthur. Kay, after a moment of stunned hesitation, did the same. Arthur was horrified. He begged them to stand up. He did not understand why they were kneeling to him. Sir Ector looked up at Arthur with tears in his eyes. He said, "You are not my son, Arthur. You were given to me as a baby by the wizard Merlin. He told me to raise you as my own, but he never told me who you really were. Now I understand. You are the son of Uther Pendragon. You are the true king of Britain." Arthur felt as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. Everything he had believed about himself, about his life, about his place in the world, all of it was suddenly different. He was not a nobody. He was not a foster child of uncertain birth. He was the son of a king. He was meant to rule. But even in that moment of overwhelming revelation, Arthur's first thought was for the man who had raised him. He lifted Sir Ector to his feet and embraced him. He said, "You will always be a father to me. Whatever I become, I will never forget what you have done for me." And to Kay, Arthur said, "You will always be my brother. When I am king, you will be at my side." This was the kind of person Arthur was. Even when the whole world was suddenly offering itself to him, he did not forget those who had loved him when he was nobody. This quality, this loyalty and gratitude would define his kingship in the years to come. But becoming king was not quite so simple as pulling a sword from a stone. The great nobles of Britain were not willing to accept this unknown boy as their ruler. They had spent years fighting among themselves for the throne. They were not about to give up their ambitions just because of some trick with a sword. They demanded that the test be repeated. Arthur put the sword back and pulled it out again. He did this over and over in front of crowds of witnesses, and every time the sword came out easily for him, while remaining stuck fast for everyone else. Still the nobles resisted. They said that there must be some deception, some magic at work. They said that a boy of 15 could not possibly rule a kingdom. They said that they would never kneel to a child of unknown parentage. The Archbishop of Canterbury supported Arthur. He declared that the miracle of the sword was a clear sign from God. But the nobles would not listen. They demanded that the decision be postponed until Easter, and then until Pentecost, hoping that, in the meantime, someone else would find a way to pull the sword free. During these months of waiting, Arthur proved himself in other ways. He was courteous and humble, never boasting about his achievement or demanding that others acknowledge him. He was brave, standing firm in the face of threats from angry nobles who resented his claim. He was wise beyond his years, speaking carefully and thoughtfully when others tried to trap him with clever questions. Merlin appeared openly now, standing at Arthur's side and advising him. The wizard's presence lent weight to Arthur's claim, for everyone knew that Merlin had served Uther Pendragon and would not support a false heir. Merlin told the story of Arthur's birth, how he had been conceived at Tintagel and given to Sir Ector to protect him from those who might wish to harm the heir to the throne. Slowly, some of the nobles began to accept Arthur. They saw his quality. They recognized that he had the bearing of a king, even if he was young. They remembered the prophecies that Merlin had made years ago about a great king who would arise to save Britain. Perhaps this boy was the fulfillment of those prophecies, but other nobles remained hostile. They formed alliances against Arthur, determined to prevent him from taking the throne. Chief among these rebels were King Lot of Orkney and King Uriens of Gore, powerful rulers in the north who had hoped to claim the high kingship for themselves. The situation teetered on the edge of civil war. Arthur had supporters, but he also had enemies. The fate of Britain hung in the balance. Finally, at Pentecost, the matter came to a head. Arthur pulled the sword from the stone one last time, in front of the largest crowd yet assembled. The common people, who had gathered to witness the miracle, began to chant his name. They had no stake in the power games of the nobles. They simply wanted a king who would bring peace and justice, and they believed that Arthur was that king. The chanting grew louder and louder. Arthur, Arthur, Arthur. The sound filled the churchyard and spilled out into the streets of London. The nobles looked at each other nervously. They realized that if they continued to resist, they might face a popular uprising. One by one, the nobles who supported Arthur stepped forward and knelt before him. They swore their allegiance, pledging to serve him as their king. Others followed, some willingly, some reluctantly. The tide had turned. Arthur was crowned King of Britain in a grand ceremony at the great church. The Archbishop placed the crown upon his head and anointed him with holy oil. The nobles swore their oaths of fealty. The people cheered until they were hoarse, but not everyone knelt. King Lot and King Uriens and their allies refused to accept Arthur. They withdrew from London and began to gather their forces. They would not give up their ambitions without a fight. Arthur watched them go with a heavy heart. He had hoped that pulling the sword would unite Britain, but instead it had divided the country even further. He was king, yes, but he was a king at war. Still, as he stood there with the crown on his head and the sword in his hand, Arthur felt a sense of purpose that he had never known before. This was what he had been born for. This was why Merlin had hidden him away and protected him all those years. He was meant to be king. He was meant to save Britain, and he would. No matter how long it took, no matter how hard the struggle, he would unite this land and bring peace to its people. He swore it to himself, there in the church, with the smell of incense in the air and the sound of cheering in his ears. The boy who had grown up as a nobody was now the King of Britain, and his legend was only beginning. To truly understand the story of King Arthur, we must spend some time with the extraordinary figure who guided him, protected him, and shaped his destiny. We must speak of Merlin, the greatest wizard that Britain has ever known. Merlin's story begins long before Arthur was born, in circumstances as strange and mysterious as anything in all the legends. The tales say that Merlin's mother was a virtuous princess, a woman of noble birth who had devoted herself to a religious life. She lived in a convent, spending her days in prayer and contemplation, far removed from the temptations of the world. But something found her there, something not of this world. The stories differ on exactly what this being was. Some say it was a demon, a creature of darkness that came to her in the night. Others say it was a spirit of the air, neither good nor evil, but something in between. Whatever it was, it came to her while she slept, and from this supernatural union, Merlin was conceived. When Merlin was born, his mother was terrified. The baby had strange qualities from the very beginning. He was born covered in dark hair, and his eyes seemed to hold an ancient wisdom that no infant should possess. The priests and holy men who examined him declared that he was the child of a demon and should be destroyed. But a wise priest named Blaise saw something different in the child. He performed a baptism, washing away any demonic taint and claiming the boy for God. The baptism did not remove Merlin's supernatural powers, but it turned them toward good purposes. Merlin would use his abilities to help mankind, not to harm it. From his inhuman father, Merlin inherited incredible gifts. He could see the future, glimpsing events that had not yet happened. He could see the past, knowing things that had occurred long before his birth. He could speak with animals and command the elements. He could change his shape, taking on any form he wished. He could cast illusions so powerful that they seemed completely real. He could move objects with his mind and travel great distances in the blink of an eye. But Merlin was not simply a creature of magic. His human mother gave him a human heart, capable of love and compassion and loyalty. He chose to use his powers in service of a great cause, the cause of Britain. He believed that this troubled land could become something glorious, a beacon of justice and civilization in a dark world. And he dedicated his long life to making that vision a reality. We have already seen how Merlin first appeared in the time of Vortigern, when he was just a boy. He revealed the two dragons beneath Vortigern's fortress and prophesied the coming of a great king. From that moment on, Merlin was a central figure in the history of Britain. He advised Aurelius Ambrosius in his wars against the Saxons. He helped Uther Pendragon win the crown. He arranged the circumstances of Arthur's conception and then spirited the baby away to safety. Every step of the way, Merlin was working toward a goal that only he could fully see. But what was that goal? What did Merlin hope to achieve? The wizard dreamed of a united Britain, a kingdom where justice prevailed and the weak were protected from the strong. He dreamed of a fellowship of noble knights who would uphold the highest ideals of courage and honour. He dreamed of a golden age that would shine so brightly that its light would never be forgotten, even after the age itself had passed. Merlin knew that he could not achieve this dream himself. For all his power, he was not a king. He was not a warrior. He could advise and guide and protect, but he could not rule. He needed a champion, a human being who could inspire others and lead them toward the vision he had seen. Merlin's most important gift to Arthur, however, was not knowledge or advice, it was Camelot. The legends say that Merlin built Camelot through a combination of magic and engineering. He chose the site carefully, a hill overlooking fertile lands, with rivers for water and forests for timber. He designed the castle to be both beautiful and defensible, with high walls and strong towers, but also with gardens and fountains and halls filled with light. Camelot was more than just a fortress. It was a symbol. It was a physical representation of everything Arthur stood for. Its gleaming white walls proclaimed that a new age had dawned in Britain. Its great hall, where the Round Table would eventually stand, was a place where justice would be dispensed and great deeds would be celebrated. Its towers, reaching toward the sky, expressed the lofty ideals that Arthur and his knights would strive to uphold. Merlin poured his magic into Camelot's construction. He enchanted the stones so that they would never crumble. He wove spells of protection around the walls so that enemies would find it difficult to attack. He created hidden passages and secret chambers for times of danger. He made the castle a place of wonder, where marvels could be seen around every corner. When Camelot was finished, it was the most magnificent castle in all of Britain, perhaps in all the world. People came from far and wide just to see it, and when they saw it, they understood that something new and wonderful was happening in this land. A king had arisen who dared to dream of a better world, and he was building that world, stone by stone. Merlin also helped Arthur in his wars against the rebellious kings. When King Lot and his allies marched against the young king, Merlin provided crucial intelligence about their movements and plans. He cast spells that confused the enemy and strengthened Arthur's forces. He appeared on the battlefield at critical moments, turning the tide with his magic, but Merlin was careful not to win Arthur's battles for him. He knew that the king needed to prove himself through his own courage and skill. If people believed that Arthur only won because of Merlin's magic, they would never truly respect him. So Merlin helped from the shadows, giving Arthur advantages but letting him claim the victories. And Arthur did claim them. Battle after battle, he defeated his enemies. His reputation grew. Knights who'd been sceptical of the boy king began to see his quality. They came to Camelot and pledged their swords to his service. The rebellion slowly crumbled as more and more nobles realized that Arthur was going to win. During these years, Merlin and Arthur developed a deep bond. The wizard was like a father to the young king, or perhaps like a grandfather, ancient and wise but full of warmth. Arthur trusted Merlin completely. He relied on his advice in all things. He could not imagine ruling without the wizard at his side. But Merlin knew something that Arthur did not. He knew that their time together was limited. The wizard could see his own future, and he knew that he would not be with Arthur forever. A doom was approaching, a fate that even Merlin's great powers could not escape. This knowledge gave a bittersweet quality to their relationship. Merlin treasured every moment with Arthur, knowing that the moments were numbered. He tried to teach the king everything he would need to know, to prepare him for the time when he would have to rule alone. He worked tirelessly to establish Camelot and the Round Table, to create institutions that would endure even after he was gone. But Merlin did not tell Arthur about his coming fate. He did not want to burden the young king with grief before it was necessary. He simply loved him and served him, and hoped that when the end came, Arthur would be strong enough to carry on. That champion was Arthur. From the moment of Arthur's birth, Merlin knew that this child was special. He saw in the baby the potential for greatness, a pure heart and a strong spirit that could change the world. That was why he took Arthur away and hid him with Sir Ector. He wanted the boy to grow up away from the corruption of the court, to develop his character without being spoiled by power and privilege. And his plan worked. Arthur grew into exactly the kind of man Merlin had hoped for. He was brave but not reckless. He was proud but not arrogant. He was ambitious but not selfish. He genuinely cared about other people and wanted to help them. He had all the qualities of a great king. Now, with Arthur on the throne, Merlin's work entered a new phase. He became the young king's closest advisor, teaching him the arts of rulership and helping him navigate the treacherous waters of politics and war. Merlin taught Arthur many things. He taught him strategy, how to deploy his forces and outmaneuver his enemies. He taught him diplomacy, how to negotiate with other rulers and build alliances. He taught him justice, how to judge disputes fairly and make laws that would benefit all his people. He taught him wisdom, how to see beyond the immediate situation and consider the long-term consequences of his actions. But Merlin also taught Arthur about magic, at least enough to understand it. The wizard wanted his king to know about the supernatural forces at work in the world, both the helpful and the harmful. He told Arthur about the old gods that the Britons had worshipped before Christianity came. He told him about the fair folk, the mysterious beings that lived in the wild places and sometimes helped or hindered mortals. He told him about the dark powers that served chaos and destruction and how to guard against them. The nature of Merlin's doom was strange and tragic. For all his wisdom, the great wizard had a weakness. He could see the future, but he could not change his own fate, and his fate was bound up with a woman. Her name was Nimue, though some stories call her Viviane or other names. She was a young woman of extraordinary beauty and intelligence, and she came to Camelot seeking to learn magic. Merlin, who had lived for centuries and seen countless mortal lives flicker past like candle flames, fell in love with her. This love was Merlin's undoing. Nimue was ambitious. She wanted Merlin's power, his knowledge, his secrets. She pretended to return his affection, encouraging his feelings while secretly plotting to use him. She begged him to teach her his magic, and Merlin, blinded by love, agreed. Spell by spell, secret by secret, Merlin shared his knowledge with Nimue. He taught her enchantments that he had never taught anyone else. He revealed mysteries that had been hidden since the beginning of the world. And all the while, Nimue was learning how to destroy him. The end came in a forest, in a cave, in a place of ancient power. The stories differ on the exact details. Some say that Nimue trapped Merlin in a cave and sealed it with a spell so powerful that even he could not break it. Others say that she imprisoned him in a tree, or in a tower of air, or in a crystal chamber beneath a lake. But all the stories agree on the essential point. Nimue used the magic that Merlin himself had taught her to imprison him forever. Merlin knew what was happening. He could have stopped it. He could have used his own magic to defeat Nimue before she completed her spell, but he chose not to. Perhaps he was too much in love to harm her. Perhaps he accepted his fate as inevitable. Perhaps he believed that his work was done, and it was time for him to rest. Whatever the reason, Merlin allowed himself to be imprisoned. The greatest wizard in the world, the architect of Arthur's rise, the dreamer who had imagined Camelot, was gone. Arthur was devastated when he learned what had happened. He searched for Merlin, sending knights to every corner of the kingdom, but the wizard could not be found. Some said they could hear his voice calling from beneath the earth, or from within ancient trees, but no one could reach him. Merlin was lost to the world. But Merlin's influence did not end with his imprisonment. The institutions he had created, Camelot, the Round Table, the Code of Chivalry, all of these endured. The lessons he had taught Arthur guided the king for the rest of his life. And the prophecies he had made continued to unfold, shaping the destiny of Britain long after his voice fell silent. In a sense, Merlin never truly left. His spirit pervaded Camelot. His wisdom echoed in the halls. His dream lived on in the hearts of Arthur and his knights. The wizard had planted seeds that would grow and flourish for generations to come. And some say that Merlin is not dead even now. Some say that he sleeps in his enchanted prison, waiting for the day when Britain needs him again. When that day comes, when the land faces its darkest hour, Merlin will awaken and return to guide a new generation of heroes. But that is a story for another time. For now, let us return to Arthur and the early years of his reign, when Merlin was still at his side and Camelot was rising like a dream made real. We have spoken of the sword in the stone, the miraculous blade that proved Arthur's right to rule. But that sword, as famous as it is, was not the weapon that would become most associated with Arthur's legend. There was another sword, a greater sword, a sword of power and magic that would become the symbol of Arthur's kingship. That sword was Excalibur. The story of how Arthur obtained Excalibur is one of the most beautiful in all the legends. It happened during the early years of his reign, when he was still fighting to establish his authority over the rebellious kings. Arthur was riding through the forest one day, accompanied by Merlin. They had been visiting a distant part of the kingdom and were making their way back to Camelot. The forest was ancient and deep, the kind of place where the boundary between the ordinary world and the world of magic grew thin. As they rode, they came upon a knight blocking the path. This knight was clad in black armour and carried a massive sword. He challenged Arthur to single combat, as was the custom of the time. Arthur, never one to refuse a challenge, accepted. The two knights fought fiercely. Arthur was skilled and brave, but the Black Knight was his equal. They traded blows for what seemed like hours, neither able to gain the advantage. Finally, in a desperate exchange, both swords shattered. The Black Knight's blade broke against Arthur's, and Arthur's blade broke against the Black Knight's. Both men were left weaponless. But the Black Knight was not finished. He drew a dagger and lunged at Arthur, intending to kill him. Arthur grappled with him, but the Black Knight was stronger. He bore Arthur to the ground and raised his dagger for the killing blow. At that moment, Merlin intervened. The wizard cast a spell that put the Black Knight into a deep sleep. Arthur, shaken but alive, got to his feet and looked at his broken sword. It had served him well, but now it was useless. He would need a new weapon. Merlin smiled mysteriously. He told Arthur that it was time for him to receive a sword worthy of a true king. He led Arthur deeper into the forest, to a place that few mortals had ever seen. They came to the shore of a lake. It was not an ordinary lake. The water was perfectly still, like a mirror reflecting the sky. Mist hung over its surface, soft and white, moving slowly in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. The air was hushed, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Arthur stared at the lake, feeling a sense of awe that he could not explain. There was magic here, old and powerful magic. He could feel it in his bones. And then he saw her. A hand rose from the centre of the lake. It was a woman's hand, slender and pale, and it held a sword. The sword was the most beautiful weapon Arthur had ever seen. Its blade gleamed with a light that seemed to come from within, as though it had captured a piece of the sun. Its hilt was wrapped in gold and silver, set with jewels that sparkled like stars, and the scabbard that hung from the hand was just as magnificent, covered in intricate designs that seemed to shift and change as Arthur watched. "This is Excalibur," Merlin said. "It was forged in Avalon, the island of the blessed, by the greatest smiths who have ever lived. Its blade will never break and will cut through any armour, but the scabbard is even more precious. Whoever wears this scabbard cannot be killed by wounds in battle. No matter how grievously they are hurt, they will not bleed to death." Arthur could hardly believe what he was seeing. A sword from Avalon, a weapon of legend, and it was being offered to him. "But who is she?" Arthur asked, his eyes fixed on the hand rising from the water. "She is the Lady of the Lake," Merlin replied. "She's one of the great powers of this land, older than the kingdoms of men. She has watched over Britain since before the Romans came, and she has chosen you, Arthur, to wield Excalibur." Arthur took this advice to heart. He wore Excalibur in its scabbard always, never letting them out of his sight. And with this magical weapon at his side, he became invincible in battle. But who was the Lady of the Lake? What was her story? The legends tell us that the Lady of the Lake was not a single person, but a title held by different women over the centuries. These women were priestesses of the old religion, guardians of the sacred mysteries that had been practiced in Britain since ancient times. They lived on Avalon, the mystical island that existed somewhere between the mortal world and the realm of the spirits. Avalon was a place of healing and magic. The apple trees there bore fruit all year round. The air was always warm and sweet. Time moved differently there than in the mortal world. A day in Avalon might be a year in Britain, or a year in Avalon might be a single day. It was a place where the wounded could be healed, where the dying could be saved, where the impossible could become possible. The Lady of the Lake who gave Arthur Excalibur was named Nimue in some stories, though this may be a different Nimue than the one who later imprisoned Merlin. Other stories call her Viviane, or Ninian, or simply the Lady. Whatever her name, she was a figure of great power and mystery. She had been watching Arthur since his birth. She knew of Merlin's plans for the young king and approved of them. She wanted Britain to be united under a just ruler, and she believed that Arthur was that ruler. Giving him Excalibur was her way of supporting his cause. But the Lady of the Lake's involvement with Arthur's story did not end with the giving of the sword. She would appear again at crucial moments, offering aid and counsel, and at the very end, when Arthur's time came, she would be there to receive him. The lady also had connections to other important figures in the legends. She was responsible for raising Lancelot, the greatest of Arthur's knights. When Lancelot was a baby, his father's kingdom was destroyed by enemies. His mother fled with him, but she was too weak to carry him far. She collapsed by the shore of a lake, and the lady appeared and took the baby. She raised him in her underwater realm, teaching him the arts of war and chivalry. That is why Lancelot was called Lancelot du Lac, which means Lancelot of the Lake. So the Lady of the Lake was a kind of fairy godmother to both Arthur and Lancelot. The two central figures of the legends, her influence shaped the entire story of Camelot. But let us return to Arthur and his new sword. With Excalibur in his hand, the young king resumed his wars against the rebellious nobles. And now nothing could stand against him. In battle after battle, Arthur led his forces to victory. Excalibur flashed like lightning, cutting down any who opposed him. The scabbard protected him from harm, so that even when enemies struck him, the wounds did not bleed. His soldiers, seeing their king fight with such supernatural power, were inspired to feats of courage they had never imagined. King Lot and King Uriens, who had been the leaders of the rebellion, began to lose heart. Their allies deserted them one by one, making peace with Arthur rather than face his invincible sword. Finally, even Lot and Uriens were forced to submit. They came to Camelot and knelt before Arthur, swearing oaths of loyalty. Arthur was merciful in victory. He did not execute the rebellious kings or strip them of their lands. Instead, he forgave them and welcomed them into his fellowship. He understood that he needed their support to unite Britain. Revenge would only breed more conflict. Forgiveness would build lasting peace. As if in response to Merlin's words, a boat appeared at the edge of the lake. It seemed to have come from nowhere, a small craft with no oars or sails. Merlin gestured for Arthur to board it. Arthur stepped into the boat, and it began to move on its own, gliding silently across the still water toward the centre of the lake. Arthur's heart was pounding, but he was not afraid. He felt as though he was moving toward his destiny. When he reached the hand holding the sword, Arthur reached out and grasped Excalibur's hilt. The hand released the weapon, and Arthur lifted it high. The sword sang as it moved through the air. a clear, pure note that seemed to echo across the lake and through the forest. Then the hand sank beneath the water and was gone. The boat carried Arthur back to shore, where Merlin was waiting. The wizard was smiling with satisfaction. Arthur had passed another test. He had proven himself worthy of Excalibur. Arthur examined his new sword with wonder. It was lighter than any sword he had ever held, yet he could feel the power in it. When he swung it, it moved so fast that it blurred. When he touched the edge of the blade, it was so sharp that it drew blood from the slightest contact. And the scabbard, as Merlin had said, was even more valuable. Arthur strapped it to his belt and felt a warmth spread through his body. He somehow knew that as long as he wore this scabbard, he would be protected from mortal harm. "Which do you value more?" Merlin asked. "The sword or the scabbard?" Arthur thought about it. "The sword," he said. "With this blade I can defeat any enemy." Merlin shook his head. "You are wrong. The scabbard is worth 10 of the sword. The sword can help you win battles, but the scabbard will keep you alive to fight another day. Remember this, Arthur. Guard the scabbard well. There are those who would steal it from you if they could." This generosity was one of Arthur's greatest qualities. He did not hold grudges. He did not seek vengeance. He wanted to build something new, something better, and he knew that this required bringing former enemies together rather than destroying them. King Lot eventually became one of Arthur's most loyal supporters. His sons, including the famous Gawain, became knights of the Round Table. King Uriens also served Arthur faithfully, and his wife, Morgan le Fay, became a complex figure at the court, sometimes helping Arthur and sometimes opposing him. With the rebellion crushed, Arthur turned his attention to the Saxons. These foreign invaders were still a threat, still raiding and conquering along the eastern coast. Arthur gathered his forces and marched against them. The war against the Saxons was long and brutal. Unlike the rebellious British kings, the Saxons could not be won over with forgiveness and diplomacy. They wanted land, and they would not stop until they had taken all of Britain or been driven out entirely. Arthur fought 12 great battles against the Saxons. The chronicles list them by name, though the exact locations are now lost to history. Mount Badon was the most famous of these battles, a siege where Arthur's forces trapped a Saxon army and destroyed it almost completely. The victory at Mount Badon broke Saxon power for a generation, giving Britain a period of peace that it had not known since the Romans left. Throughout these wars, Excalibur was Arthur's constant companion. The sword became famous throughout the land. Enemies fled at the sight of its gleaming blade. Allies took courage from its presence. Excalibur became more than just a weapon. It became a symbol of Arthur's kingship, a sign that he was chosen by powers greater than any mortal lord. But Arthur never forgot Merlin's warning about the scabbard. He guarded it carefully, knowing that without it he was vulnerable. The scabbard was his true protection, even more than the sword. Unfortunately, Arthur's care was not enough. The scabbard would eventually be stolen from him by treachery, and this theft would have terrible consequences. But that is a story for later in our tale. For now, let us simply appreciate this moment of triumph. Arthur had united Britain. He had defeated the Saxons. He had proven himself worthy of the magical gifts he had received. He was the king that Merlin had always believed he could be, and with Excalibur at his side, he was ready to build the golden age that would make his name immortal. No story of King Arthur would be complete without speaking of the Knights of the Round Table. These brave warriors were the heart and soul of Camelot, the champions who carried Arthur's vision of justice and honour throughout the land. Their adventures have inspired countless tales, and their names are still remembered today, centuries after the legends first took shape. But before we meet the knights themselves, we must understand the Round Table and why it was so important. The idea of the Round Table came from Merlin, though some stories say it was a wedding gift to Arthur from King Leodegrance, the father of Guinevere. Whatever its origin, the table was designed to solve a problem that had plagued kings since the beginning of time. When knights gathered for a feast or a council, there was always conflict over who should sit where. The seats closest to the king were positions of honour, and everyone wanted them. Knights would argue and fight over seating arrangements, sometimes even drawing swords over perceived insults. This kind of petty conflict undermined the unity that Arthur was trying to build. The Round Table eliminated this problem. Because the table was round, there was no head and no foot. Every seat was equal. No knight could claim precedence over another based on where he sat. When they gathered at the Round Table, all the knights were brothers, equal in honour and dignity. This was a revolutionary idea. In a world obsessed with hierarchy and status, Arthur created a fellowship based on merit rather than birth. It did not matter if a knight was the son of a king or the son of a peasant. What mattered was his courage, his honour, his dedication to the ideals of chivalry. If he proved himself worthy, he could sit at the Round Table alongside the greatest lords in the land. The Round Table could seat 150 knights, according to most versions of the legend. Each seat had a name inscribed upon it, appearing magically when the rightful occupant took his place. One seat, however, was different from all the others. It was called the Siege Perilous, which means the dangerous seat. This seat was reserved for the knight who would achieve the Holy Grail, and anyone else who sat in it would be destroyed. The Siege Perilous remained empty for many years, waiting for its destined occupant. Now let us meet some of the knights who gathered at this famous table. Sir Kay was one of the first, which was only fitting since he was Arthur's foster brother. Kay had been there from the beginning, before Arthur knew he was king, when they were just two boys growing up together on Sir Ector's estate. Kay was not the greatest warrior among the knights, and his temperament could be difficult. He was often sharp-tongued and quick to anger, but he was loyal to Arthur beyond question, and the king never forgot the brother who had shared his childhood. Arthur made Kay his seneschal, which meant he was in charge of running the household of Camelot. This was an important position, requiring organisational skills and attention to detail. Kay performed these duties well, even if he sometimes complained about the work. And when battle came, Kay was always there, fighting at his king's side. Sir Bedivere was another of the earliest knights. A warrior who had served Arthur since before the crown sat on his head. Bedivere was known for his unwavering loyalty and his skill with a spear. He had lost one hand in battle, but this disability did not slow him down. He learned to fight just as effectively with his remaining hand, and some said he was even more dangerous than before, because enemies underestimated him. There was also Mordred, who some stories say was another son of King Lot, and therefore Gawain's brother. But Mordred's true parentage was more complicated and more troubling, as we shall discuss later. For now, let us simply note that he too sat at the Round Table, though his presence there would eventually bring disaster. Sir Percival came to Camelot as a naive young man who knew nothing of knights or chivalry. He had been raised by his mother in a remote forest, far from civilization. His mother had lost her husband and other sons to warfare, and she was determined to keep Percival safe by keeping him ignorant of the world of fighting and adventure. But when Percival saw a group of knights raiding through the forest, their armour gleaming in the sunlight, he was captivated. He had never seen anything so magnificent. He asked his mother what these shining beings were, and she, hoping to discourage his interest, told him they were angels. Percival was not discouraged. He wanted to be an angel too. He left his mother's forest home and made his way to Camelot, determined to become a knight. When he arrived, he was laughably unprepared. He did not know how to wear armour or hold a sword properly. He did not understand the customs of the court. He made mistake after mistake, and many of the knights laughed at him. But Arthur saw something special in this earnest young man. He saw courage and purity of heart. He accepted Percival into his service and assigned experienced knights to train him. Percival learned quickly, driven by his desire to prove himself worthy. Within a few years he had become one of the finest knights at Camelot. Percival's innocence and purity would make him one of the few knights capable of approaching the Holy Grail. His story is one of the most moving in all the legends, a tale of a simple boy who became a great hero through the goodness of his heart. Sir Bors was a knight of deep religious faith. He was the cousin of Lancelot and shared some of that great knight's skill in battle. But where Lancelot was passionate and sometimes reckless, Bors was steady and thoughtful. He considered every action carefully, weighing it against his moral principles. Bors was one of the 3 knights who would ultimately achieve the Grail quest, along with Percival and Galahad. His faith sustained him through trials that would have broken lesser men. He faced temptations and dangers that tested his soul, and he emerged victorious because he never wavered from his beliefs. After the Grail quest, Bors returned to Camelot and continued to serve Arthur faithfully. He was one of the few Grail knights who came back to the mortal world, choosing to use his remaining years in service rather than departing for heavenly realms. Sir Tristan was a knight whose story is almost as famous as Arthur's own. He was the nephew of King Mark of Cornwall, and his tale is one of tragic love. Tristan was sent to Ireland to bring back a princess named Isolde, who was to marry his uncle King Mark. During the voyage home, Tristan and Isolde accidentally drank a love potion that had been intended for Isolde and her future husband. The potion bound them together with an unbreakable passion. They fell deeply, desperately in love. But Isolde was promised to King Mark, and she had to honour that promise. She married the king as planned, but she and Tristan could not stay away from each other. They conducted a secret affair, meeting whenever they could, knowing that discovery would mean death for both of them. Bedivere would be with Arthur until the very end. He would be the last knight standing at the final battle, the one who would carry out Arthur's last wishes. But that sad duty lay far in the future. For now, Bedivere was simply one of the king's most trusted companions, a friend who had proven himself through years of faithful service. Sir Gawain was the son of King Lot, one of the rulers who had initially rebelled against Arthur. When Lot made peace with the king, he sent his sons to Camelot to serve as knights. Gawain was the eldest and the most famous of these brothers. Gawain was a remarkable warrior with a unique gift. His strength waxed and waned with the sun. In the morning, he was strong. At noon, when the sun was at its highest, his strength tripled, making him nearly invincible. As the afternoon wore on, his power gradually decreased until evening, when he returned to normal. Knights who faced Gawain quickly learned to avoid fighting him at midday, but Gawain was more than just a powerful fighter. He was known for his courtesy, especially toward women. He treated all ladies with respect and kindness, defending their honour and coming to their aid whenever they needed help. This courtesy made him beloved throughout the kingdom. Mothers told their daughters that they should hope to marry a man like Gawain. Gawain had several brothers, who also became knights of the Round Table. Gaheris, Gareth and Agravain all served at Camelot, though their fates would be very different. Gareth, in particular, became a knight of great renown, known for his gentle nature and his skill in tournaments. Agravain, unfortunately, would play a darker role in the story, being one of those who exposed the affair between Lancelot and Guinevere. Their love story is full of narrow escapes, clever deceptions, and heartbreaking separations. King Mark suspected the truth, but could never quite prove it. Tristan was eventually banished from Cornwall and wandered the world, having adventures and winning renown. But he always returned to Isolde, drawn by the power of the love potion that neither of them could resist. In the end, their love destroyed them both. Tristan was wounded in battle, and the only person who could heal him was Isolde. He sent for her, telling his messenger to fly white sails if she was coming, and black sails if she was not. Isolde came immediately, her ship bearing white sails. But Tristan's jealous wife, another woman also named Isolde, whom he had married in a futile attempt to forget his true love, lied to him. She told him the sails were black. Believing that his beloved had abandoned him, Tristan died of grief. When Isolde arrived and found him dead, she lay down beside him and died as well, her heart broken beyond repair. Tristan's story reminds us that even the greatest knights were human, subject to the same passions and weaknesses as everyone else. His tale is a warning about the power of love and the tragedy that can result when duty and desire come into conflict. Sir Lamorak was considered by many to be the third greatest knight in the world. After Lancelot and Tristan, he was the son of King Pellinore, a noble ruler who had been one of Arthur's early allies. Lamorak inherited his father's strength and skill, becoming a formidable warrior who won tournament after tournament. But Lamorak made a fatal enemy. He began an affair with Queen Morgause, the mother of Gawain and his brothers. Morgause was a widow by this time, her husband King Lot having died in battle. But Gawain and his brothers considered the affair an insult to their father's memory. The sons of Lot ambushed Lamorak and killed him. It was a dishonourable act, several knights attacking one, and it stained their reputations forever. Gawain in particular carried the guilt of this murder for the rest of his life. The killing of Lamorak created a feud that would simmer beneath the surface of Camelot for years, eventually contributing to the Fellowship's destruction. Sir Galahad was the purest and most perfect of all the knights. He was the son of Lancelot, conceived under unusual circumstances that we will discuss later. From his birth, Galahad was marked for a special destiny. He was raised in a convent by nuns who recognised his extraordinary nature and prepared him for his future role. When Galahad came to Camelot, he was young and beautiful, with an air of holiness that set him apart from the other knights. He went directly to the Siege Perilous, the dangerous seat that had remained empty for so long, and sat down. Everyone expected him to be destroyed, as others who had dared to sit there had been. But nothing happened. The seat accepted him. He was the one it had been waiting for. Galahad's arrival signalled the beginning of the Grail quest. He was the knight destined to achieve what no other could, to find the Holy Grail and unlock its mysteries. His purity was absolute. He had never sinned, never been tempted, never wavered from the path of righteousness. He was more angel than man. This perfection made Galahad a difficult character to relate to. He lacked the human flaws that made knights like Lancelot and Gawain so compelling. But his role in the legends was not to be relatable. It was to represent an ideal, a vision of what humanity could be at its very best. Galahad showed the other knights what they were striving for, even if they could never quite reach it. And then there was Sir Lancelot de Lac, the greatest knight of them all. But Lancelot's story is so important, so central to everything that happened at Camelot, that he deserves his own chapter. We will speak of him soon. These were just some of the knights who sat at the round table. There were many others, 150 in all according to the legends. Each had his own story, his own adventures, his own triumphs and failures. Together they formed a fellowship unlike any the world had ever seen. The code they followed was called chivalry. This code demanded that they be brave in battle, never fleeing from an enemy or refusing a challenge. It demanded that they be loyal to their king, obeying his commands and defending his honour. It demanded that they protect the weak especially women and children who could not protect themselves. It demanded that they be honest and keep their word, even when doing so was difficult or dangerous. It demanded that they be merciful to defeated enemies, offering them the chance to surrender rather than killing them outright. Not all the knights lived up to this code perfectly. They were human beings after all, with human weaknesses. Some were proud, some were jealous, some were quick to anger, some made terrible mistakes that they regretted for the rest of their lives. But they tried. They strove to be better than they were, to live up to the ideals that the Round Table represented. And in their trying, they created something beautiful, a vision of nobility and honour that has inspired people for centuries. Arthur was proud of his knights. He loved them like brothers, like sons. He rejoiced in their victories and mourned their deaths. He forgave their failings and celebrated their virtues. The Round Table was his greatest achievement, greater even than his military conquests. It was a community of the best and bravest, united by shared values and mutual respect. But communities, like all human creations, are fragile. The bonds that held the Round Table together would eventually be tested to the breaking point. Jealousy, betrayal, and forbidden love would tear the fellowship apart. The golden age of Camelot would come to an end, but that ending was still far away. For now the knights rode out on their quests, seeking adventure and glory. They rescued maidens in distress. They fought monsters and villains. They upheld justice in a world that desperately needed it. They were the shining examples of what humanity could achieve. And at the centre of it all sat Arthur, the once and future king, watching his dream come to life around him. The Round Table was full. Camelot was at its height. The golden age had begun. We have spoken of Arthur's early battles against the rebellious kings and his wars against the Saxons, but these were only the beginning of his military career. Throughout his reign, Arthur fought many wars, defending Britain from enemies both foreign and domestic. These conflicts shaped his legend and established his reputation as one of the greatest warrior kings in history. Let us explore these wars in more detail, understanding the challenges Arthur faced and how he overcame them. The Saxon wars were the most important and the most prolonged. The Saxons were not a single unified enemy, but a collection of tribes and war bands, each with its own leaders and its own ambitions. Some came as raiders, striking quickly and retreating before Arthur's forces could respond. Others came as settlers, bringing their families and intending to stay permanently. Still others came as mercenaries, hired by British lords who were willing to use foreign swords against their own countrymen. Arthur developed different strategies for dealing with these different threats. Against the raiders, he built a network of coastal forts and signal stations. When Saxon ships were spotted, fires would be lit on hilltops, passing the warning from station to station until it reached the nearest garrison. Mounted warriors would then ride to intercept the raiders before they could do too much damage. Against the settlers, Arthur waged wars of conquest, driving them out of territories they had occupied and reclaiming the land for Britain. These campaigns were brutal and bloody. The Saxons fought fiercely for their new homes, and Arthur's forces had to root them out village by village, sometimes hill by hill. Against the mercenaries and their British employers, Arthur used a combination of military force and diplomacy. He punished those who hired foreign warriors to fight against their own people, stripping them of their lands and titles. But he also tried to address the underlying grievances that drove some Britons to such desperate measures. He reformed the laws, reduced taxes, and worked to create a more just society where people did not feel they needed foreign help to get fair treatment. The 12 great battles against the Saxons are listed in the ancient chronicles, though the exact locations of most of them are now unknown. The river Glyne, the river Dubglas, the river Bassus, The forest of Celadon, the fort of Gwinion, the city of the Legion, the river Tribrut, Mount Acnid, and finally Mount Badon. These names echo down through history, marking the stages of Arthur's long struggle against the invaders. Mount Badon was the decisive victory. The chronicles say that Arthur personally killed 960 enemies in this battle, a number that is surely exaggerated but conveys the scale of the triumph. The Saxon army was virtually annihilated. Those who survived fled back to their ships and sailed away, and for a generation afterward, the Saxon advance was halted. The peace that followed Mount Badon was the foundation of Arthur's golden age. With the external threat neutralised, at least temporarily, Arthur could focus on building his kingdom. He established laws and courts. He encouraged trade and agriculture. He patronised the arts and learning. Britain flourished, as it had not flourished since the days of the Romans. But the Saxons were not the only enemies Arthur faced. There were also threats from the north, from the Picts and the Scots who lived beyond the old Roman walls. These fierce warriors had been raiding Britain for centuries, and they did not stop just because Arthur was king. The knights also served as leaders for Arthur's larger armies. Each knight had his own followers, men-at-arms and squires who owed him personal loyalty. When Arthur called his banners, these followers came too, swelling his forces with experienced fighters. Beyond their military value, the knights served a symbolic purpose. They represented Arthur's ideals, the values of courage, honour, and justice that he wanted his kingdom to embody. When people saw the knights riding by, they saw the dream of Camelot made flesh. They saw proof that a better world was possible. Arthur was a skilled tactician who used every advantage he could find. He studied the terrain before battles, choosing ground that favoured his forces. He used scouts and spies to learn about enemy movements. He employed deception and surprise, attacking when and where his enemies least expected. One of Arthur's favourite tactics was the cavalry charge. His knights, mounted on heavy horses and armed with long lances, could smash through enemy formations like a hammer through glass. The psychological impact of a cavalry charge was as devastating as the physical impact. Enemies who saw a wall of armoured knights thundering toward them often broke and fled before contact was even made. But Arthur also knew when not to fight. He was patient, willing to wait for the right moment rather than rushing into unfavourable battles. He understood that preserving his forces was sometimes more important than winning a particular engagement. A king who lost his army in a Pyrrhic victory would not be king for long. Arthur's wars were not without cost. Many good men died in his service. Many families lost fathers and sons and brothers. The chronicles do not dwell on this suffering, preferring to celebrate the victories rather than mourn the losses. But we should remember that behind every glorious battle there was grief and pain. Arthur himself was wounded many times. Despite the protection of Excalibur's scabbard, he accumulated scars from countless fights. He knew the fear of battle, the chaos and confusion, the moments when everything seemed lost. He was not a distant commander who watched from safety while others did the fighting. He led from the front, sharing the dangers with his men. This willingness to risk himself earned Arthur the fierce loyalty of his warriors. They knew that their king would never ask them to do anything he would not do himself. They followed him into the most desperate situations, confident that he would bring them through. As the years passed and victory followed victory, Arthur's reputation grew to legendary proportions. Bards sang of his deeds in every hall in Britain. His name was known across the sea, in Gaul and Germania, and even in distant Rome. He had become more than a king. He had become a symbol, an ideal, a figure that people would remember for centuries. But even as Arthur reached the height of his power, The seeds of his downfall were being planted. Enemies were gathering in the shadows, waiting for their chance. And the greatest threat would come not from foreign invaders or rebellious lords, but from within Arthur's own family. The wars had made Arthur great, but the peace that followed would test him in ways that war never had. Arthur led several campaigns into the northern territories, pushing back the raiders and establishing buffer zones to protect his people. He rebuilt and garrisoned the old Roman forts along the wall, creating a defensive line that the northern tribes could not easily penetrate. He also made alliances with some of the northern kingdoms, turning potential enemies into allies through diplomacy and marriage. The Irish were another source of trouble. Raiders from Ireland had been attacking the western coasts of Britain for generations, carrying off slaves and plunder. Arthur built a fleet of ships to patrol these waters and intercept the raiders before they could land. He also sent expeditions to Ireland itself, striking at the bases from which the raids were launched. Some legends say that Arthur conquered Ireland entirely, adding it to his growing empire. Other legends say he merely forced the Irish kings to pay tribute and stop their raiding. Whatever the truth, the western coast became safer during Arthur's reign than they had been for many years. Beyond Britain and Ireland, Arthur's ambitions grew even larger. The legends tell of campaigns on the continent, wars against the Romans themselves. These stories may reflect real conflicts with the remnants of Roman authority in Gaul, or they may be later additions to the legend, designed to make Arthur seem even more impressive. According to these tales, Arthur crossed the sea with a great army and conquered large portions of Gaul. He defeated the Roman forces sent against him and was on the verge of marching on Rome itself when news from home forced him to return. These continental campaigns established Arthur as a figure of European importance, not just a local British king. But wars are not won by kings alone. Arthur's success depended on the warriors who fought beside him, and chief among these were his Knights of the Round Table. Every great king needs a queen, and Arthur's queen was one of the most famous women in all of legend. Her name was Guinevere, and her story is one of beauty and tragedy, of love and betrayal, of a heart torn between duty and desire. Guinevere was the daughter of King Leodegrance of Cameliard, a realm in the north of Britain. Leodegrance had been one of Arthur's early supporters, standing by the young king when others doubted him. He had fought alongside Arthur against the rebellious nobles and the Saxons. The bond between the two kings was strong. When Arthur decided it was time to marry, his thoughts turned naturally to Leodegrance's daughter. He had heard tales of Guinevere's beauty, how she was the fairest maiden in all the land. Her hair was said to shine like gold in sunlight. Her eyes were the deep blue of a summer sky. Her skin was smooth and pale as fresh cream. Her voice was musical, her laugh like the ringing of silver bells. But Arthur did not choose Guinevere for her beauty alone. He chose her because an alliance with Leodegrance would strengthen his kingdom. He chose her because she was known to be intelligent and capable, qualities that would make her a good partner in ruling. He chose her because Merlin, despite having some reservations, did not forbid the match. Those reservations troubled Arthur. When he told Merlin of his intention to marry Guinevere, the wizard grew quiet and thoughtful. After a long pause, Merlin said that Guinevere was indeed the fairest and most noble lady in the land. But he also said that she was not wholesome for Arthur to take to wife. He warned that Guinevere and Lancelot would love each other, and that this love would bring destruction to the kingdom. Arthur was troubled by this prophecy, but he did not heed it. He was young and in love, or at least in love with the idea of Guinevere. He could not imagine that the beautiful princess could bring him anything but happiness, and so he set aside Merlin's warning and sent messengers to Leodegrance asking for his daughter's hand. Was overjoyed. To have his daughter become the Queen of Britain was a greater honour than he had ever dared to hope for. He agreed immediately and began preparations for the wedding. As a wedding gift, Leodegrance gave Arthur the Round Table. This was the famous table that Merlin had made for Uther Pendragon years before. Leodegrance had been its keeper since Uther's death. Now it would go to Camelot, where it would become the centrepiece of Arthur's court. The wedding was the grandest celebration Britain had ever seen. Kings and nobles came from every corner of the land. The feasting lasted for days. Bards sang songs praising the beauty of the bride and the valour of the groom. It seemed like the beginning of a perfect union, and in many ways it was. Guinevere proved to be an excellent queen. She was gracious and kind, beloved by the people of Camelot. She managed the royal household with skill and efficiency. She advised Arthur on matters of state, offering perspectives he might not have considered. She was a true partner in every sense. Arthur loved her. There is no doubt about that. He loved her beauty, yes, but he also loved her spirit, her intelligence, her strength. She was not a passive ornament, but an active participant in the life of the kingdom. She challenged him, supported him, and made him a better king. Guinevere loved Arthur too, at least at first. She admired his courage and his vision. She was proud to be his queen. She believed in the dream of Camelot and worked hard to make it a reality. But love between a king and queen is complicated. Arthur was often away, fighting wars or travelling to distant parts of his kingdom. Guinevere was left behind at Camelot, managing affairs in his absence. She was surrounded by knights and courtiers, but she was also lonely. The crown was heavy, and she bore its weight largely alone. And then Lancelot came to Camelot. We will speak more of Lancelot in the next chapter, but we must mention him here because his arrival changed everything for Guinevere. From the moment she saw him, something stirred in her heart. He was the most handsome knight she had ever seen, with dark hair and piercing eyes and a grace of movement that took her breath away. He was also the greatest warrior in the world, which made him fascinating and impressive. Lancelot fell in love with Guinevere just as quickly. He tried to hide it, tried to suppress it, but the feeling was too strong. He had pledged his sword to Arthur, and he was determined to be loyal. But every time he looked at the queen, his heart ached with longing. For years they resisted their feelings. They were courteous to each other, but kept their distance. They never spoke of what was in their hearts. They tried to be faithful to Arthur, whom they both loved and respected. But love, especially forbidden love, has a way of breaking through barriers. Slowly, gradually, Lancelot and Guinevere drew closer. A lingering glance here, a touch of hands there. Conversations that lasted longer than they should. Moments alone that became more and more frequent. Finally, they could resist no longer. They became lovers. The affair was conducted in secret, hidden from Arthur and the court. Lancelot and Guinevere were careful, meeting only when they were sure they would not be discovered. They lived in constant fear of exposure, knowing that the consequences would be catastrophic. But secrets have a way of coming out, especially in a court full of ambitious and watchful eyes. Some people suspected the truth. Others knew it for certain but kept silent out of loyalty or fear. The situation was a powder keg, waiting for a spark. Lancelot crossed the sword bridge on his hands and knees, his flesh torn and bleeding, driven by his love for Guinevere. He reached the other side, more dead than alive, but he did not stop. He found Meleagant and defeated him in combat, rescuing the queen. This story illustrates both the depth of Lancelot's love and the danger of his obsession. He would do anything for Guinevere, suffer any pain, face any danger. His devotion was noble in some ways, but it was also destructive. It led him to neglect his other duties and ultimately to betray his king. Guinevere inspired this devotion in many knights, not just Lancelot. There was something about her that made men want to serve her, to prove themselves worthy of her attention. She was the ideal of womanhood in the chivalric tradition, the lady for whom knights performed their deeds of valour. But Guinevere was more than just an object of devotion. She was a person with her own thoughts, feelings, and desires. She struggled with her situation, trying to balance her roles as queen, wife, and lover. She made mistakes, but she also showed courage and strength in difficult circumstances. One aspect of Guinevere's character that the legends emphasize is her inability to have children. Despite years of marriage, she never gave Arthur an heir. This was a source of great sorrow for both of them and a political problem for the kingdom. Without a legitimate heir, the succession was uncertain, which created opportunities for ambitious men to scheme and plot. Some versions of the legend suggest that Guinevere's barrenness was a punishment for her adultery, a sign of divine disapproval. Others treat it simply as a tragic circumstance, one of the many sorrows that shadowed the golden age of Camelot. Whatever the reason, the lack of an heir would have profound consequences. It meant that when Arthur died, there would be no clear successor. It opened the door for Mordred, Arthur's illegitimate son, to make his own claim to the throne. The empty cradle at Camelot was a wound that would never heal. But Guinevere's story does not end in tragedy alone. After the fall of Camelot, after Arthur's death and Lancelot's exile, Guinevere retired to a convent. She took religious vows and spent her remaining years in prayer and penance. She sought forgiveness for her sins and found perhaps a measure of peace. When Lancelot came to see her one last time, she refused him. She told him that their love had brought destruction to everything they held dear. She told him to go away and never return. She chose God over earthly love, duty over desire. Lancelot obeyed her wishes. He became a hermit, living out his days in solitude and prayer. When Guinevere died, he came to bury her beside Arthur at Glastonbury. Then he himself died, his heart finally broken beyond repair. It is a sad ending to a sad story, but there is also something noble in it, something redemptive. Guinevere and Lancelot both recognised their faults and tried to make amends. They did not excuse their behaviour or blame others for their choices. They accepted responsibility and sought forgiveness. In the end, Guinevere was more than just a beautiful queen or a faithless wife. She was a complex human being who loved deeply, suffered greatly, and found her way to grace. Her story reminds us that even the most flawed among us can find redemption if we are willing to seek it. Guinevere was torn apart by guilt. She loved Arthur and did not want to hurt him. She knew that what she was doing was wrong, a betrayal of her marriage vows and her duty as queen. But she also loved Lancelot with a passion she could not control. She was trapped between two loves, unable to give up either one. Arthur, for his part, may have suspected something. Some versions of the legend suggest that he knew about the affair, but chose to ignore it. He loved both Guinevere and Lancelot too much to confront them. He hoped that if he pretended not to see, the problem would somehow resolve itself. This was a mistake, of course. Problems do not go away when you ignore them. They fester and grow until they can no longer be contained. Arthur's refusal to address the situation only delayed the inevitable reckoning. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. For many years the affair remained hidden, and Camelot continued to flourish. Guinevere played her role as queen with grace and dignity. She presided over tournaments and feasts. She dispensed charity to the poor. She was the heart of Camelot, the centre around which the court revolved. The queen had her own adventures as well. Several times she was kidnapped by enemies who hoped to use her as leverage against Arthur. Each time she was rescued, usually by Lancelot, whose devotion to her was obvious to everyone, even if the true nature of their relationship was not. One famous story tells of how Guinevere was abducted by a knight named Meleagant, who carried her off to his kingdom of Gora. Lancelot pursued them, but Meleagant had destroyed all the bridges, making the kingdom nearly impossible to enter. The only way across was a sword bridge, a giant blade stretched over a chasm, its edge sharp enough to cut anyone who tried to cross. Now we come to the knight who stands at the very centre of the Arthurian legends, the greatest warrior the world has ever known, the man whose love and loyalty would both elevate and destroy Camelot. We come to Sir Lancelot du Lac. Lancelot's story begins in tragedy. He was born the son of King Ban of Benwick, a small kingdom in what is now France. Ban was an ally of Arthur's, one of the kings who had supported him in his early wars. But Ban had enemies of his own, and while he was away helping Arthur, those enemies attacked his kingdom. Ban rushed home, but he was too late. His castle was in flames. His kingdom was lost. As he watched everything he had built being destroyed, his heart gave out, and he died on the spot. Ban's wife, Queen Elaine, was fleeing with their infant son when she saw her husband fall. She set the baby down on the shore of a lake and ran to her husband's side. By the time she reached him, he was dead, and when she turned back to retrieve her child, she saw something miraculous and terrifying. A woman had risen from the lake. She was beautiful beyond description, clad in flowing white garments that seemed to shimmer with their own light. She bent down and picked up the baby. Then she turned and walked back into the water, taking the child with her. Queen Elaine screamed and tried to follow, but the woman and the baby had vanished beneath the surface. Elaine collapsed in grief, having lost her husband and her son in the same terrible hour. The woman from the lake was, of course, the Lady of the Lake, the same mysterious figure who would later give Arthur his sword Excalibur. She took the baby Lancelot to her realm beneath the waters, a magical place where time moved differently and wonders were commonplace. There, in that enchanted kingdom, Lancelot grew to manhood. The lady raised him as her own son, teaching him everything he would need to know. She gave him the finest tutors in the arts of war. She taught him courtesy and honour. She prepared him for the destiny she knew awaited him. When Lancelot was 18 years old, the lady decided it was time for him to enter the mortal world. She brought him to the surface and led him to Camelot, where Arthur held his court. She presented him to the king as a candidate for knighthood. Arthur was impressed by the young man. Lancelot was tall and strong, with a handsome face and an air of nobility that marked him as someone special. When Arthur tested his skills, he found that Lancelot was already a better fighter than most of the knights at court. There was something almost supernatural about his abilities. Arthur knighted Lancelot gladly, welcoming him to the Round Table. He had no idea that this young knight would become both his greatest champion and his greatest sorrow. Lancelot quickly proved himself the finest warrior in Camelot. In tournaments, he defeated every opponent. In battle, he was unstoppable. He seemed to have no fear, charging into the thickest fighting and emerging victorious every time. Other knights watched him with a mixture of admiration and envy. But Lancelot was more than just a fighter. He was kind and generous, always ready to help those in need. He rescued countless maidens from danger. He defended the weak against the strong. He embodied all the virtues of chivalry, and he did so with a humility that made him beloved rather than resented. The problem, of course, was Guinevere. From the first moment Lancelot saw the queen, he was lost. Her beauty struck him like a physical blow. He could not look away from her. He could not think of anything else. He knew immediately that he loved her, and he knew just as immediately that this love was forbidden. Lancelot tried to fight his feelings. He threw himself into quests and adventures, hoping that distance would cool his passion. He stayed away from court for months at a time, seeking any excuse to avoid the temptation that Guinevere represented. But no matter how far he travelled, no matter how many monsters he slew or villains he defeated, his thoughts always returned to her. And Guinevere felt the same pull. She tried to maintain her dignity, to remember her duty as Arthur's wife. But whenever Lancelot was near, her heart raced and her cheeks flushed. She found herself watching for him, listening for his voice, treasuring every moment in his presence. The court noticed, of course. How could they not? The greatest knight in the world, devoted to the Queen with an intensity that went beyond mere service. The most beautiful woman in Britain, lighting up whenever that particular knight entered the room. People whispered. People speculated, but no one dared speak openly, not while Arthur seemed oblivious, and both Lancelot and Guinevere maintained the appearance of propriety. For years this delicate balance held. Lancelot served Arthur with absolute loyalty in all things except one. He fought the king's battles, carried out his commands, and helped build the glory of Camelot. He was the champion that every king dreams of having, the sword that never fails. Arthur loved Lancelot like a brother. He trusted him completely. He gave him honours and lands, and praised him publicly as the finest knight who had ever lived. This trust made Lancelot's secret all the more painful. Every time Arthur embraced him, every time the king called him friend, Lancelot felt the knife of guilt twist in his heart. But guilt was not enough to stop him. Eventually, inevitably, Lancelot and Guinevere crossed the line, from longing looks and innocent touches to something more. They became lovers in truth, meeting in secret, stealing moments together whenever they could. The affair was passionate and all-consuming. When they were together, nothing else existed. The world shrank to just the two of them, lost in each other. But when they were apart, the fear and guilt came rushing back. They knew what they were risking. They knew what would happen if they were discovered. But they could not stop. Lancelot's love for Guinevere affected everything he did. He fought in tournaments wearing her favour, a token of her affection that he displayed proudly. He dedicated his victories to her, publicly proclaiming his devotion, even as he pretended it was merely the courtly love that knights were expected to show their queen. He became her champion in every sense, defending her honour against anyone who dared question it. This devotion led Lancelot into many adventures. One of the most famous involved a knight named Melagant, whom we mentioned earlier. Melagant abducted Guinevere and carried her off to his father's kingdom of Gore. Lancelot pursued immediately, not waiting for Arthur or any other knights to accompany him. The pursuit was harrowing. Melagant had prepared obstacles to slow any rescuer. Lancelot faced them all, without hesitation. When he came to the sword bridge, that terrible blade stretched across a chasm. He did not pause to consider the danger. He crawled across on his hands and knees, the sharp edge cutting deep into his flesh, leaving a trail of blood behind him. When he reached the other side, Lancelot was barely able to stand. His hands and knees were sliced to the bone. Any other man would have collapsed and died from such wounds. But Lancelot's love gave him strength beyond normal human limits. He found Melagant and challenged him to combat. Even wounded as he was, Lancelot defeated Melagant. He would have killed him, but Melagant's father begged for mercy, and Guinevere asked Lancelot to spare her captor. Lancelot obeyed, though he knew Melagant would cause trouble again. For Guinevere, he would do anything. The rescue of Guinevere from Gora became one of the most celebrated deeds in all of Camelot's history. Bards sang of Lancelot's courage, his determination, his willingness to suffer any pain for the sake of his queen. What they did not sing about, at least not openly, was the true nature of his motivation. Lancelot's adventures were not limited to rescuing Guinevere. He travelled throughout Britain and beyond, seeking wrongs to right and injustices to correct. He freed prisoners from cruel captors. He broke enchantments that had trapped innocent people. He defeated giants and monsters and wicked knights. His reputation grew until he was known throughout the world as the greatest champion of the age. One of his most significant adventures involved the castle of Corbenic, where the Holy Grail was kept. Lancelot came to this castle during his wanderings and was welcomed by its king, a man named Pelles. Pelles knew a prophecy that said the best knight in the world would father a child who would achieve the Grail quest. He believed Lancelot was that knight. Pelles had a daughter named Elaine, a beautiful and virtuous maiden. He wanted Lancelot to father a child with her, but he knew that Lancelot would never willingly betray Guinevere, even with another woman. So Pelles resorted to trickery. With the help of a sorceress, Pelles made Lancelot believe that Elaine was Guinevere. Under this enchantment, Lancelot went to Elaine's chamber and lay with her, thinking all the while that he was with his beloved queen. When morning came and the enchantment faded, Lancelot was horrified to discover what had happened. He had been faithful to Guinevere in his heart, if not in his actions. He had never wanted any woman but her. The deception filled him with shame and rage. He fled from Corbenic, cursing himself for his weakness, even though he had been tricked. But the deed was done. Elaine was pregnant. 9 months later she gave birth to a son. She named him Galahad. This child, conceived through deception, but destined for greatness, would grow up to be the purest knight the world had ever seen. Galahad would achieve what his father could not. He would find the Holy Grail and unlock its mysteries. The sin of Lancelot's night with Elaine would produce the most holy of all knights. When Guinevere learned what had happened at Corbenic, she was furious. She did not care that Lancelot had been deceived. She only knew that he had been with another woman. Her jealousy was fierce and unforgiving. She banished Lancelot from her presence, refusing to speak to him or even look at him. Lancelot was devastated. Guinevere's love was the centre of his existence. Without it, he had nothing. He fell into a deep despair that bordered on madness. He wandered away from Camelot, abandoning his duties and his friends. He lived like a wild man in the forests, eating roots and berries, sleeping on the bare ground, forgetting who he was. For 2 years, Lancelot was lost. Knights went searching for him, but no one could find him. The greatest warrior in the world had vanished, driven mad by the loss of his lady's favour. Eventually, Lancelot was found and healed, his sanity restored through the intervention of the Grail and the prayers of those who loved him. He returned to Camelot, and Guinevere, her anger cooled by time and fear for his safety, forgave him. They resumed their affair, more careful than before, but no less passionate. The years passed. Lancelot continued to serve Arthur and love Guinevere. He watched his son Galahad grow into a young man of extraordinary virtue. He saw the Round Table reach its full glory. 150 knights dedicated to justice and honour. He was part of something magnificent, even as his secret threatened to destroy it all. Lancelot knew that he was living a lie. He knew that every day he spent at Camelot, pretending to be Arthur's loyal friend while betraying him with his wife, added to his guilt. He thought about confessing many times. He thought about leaving Camelot forever, removing himself from temptation, but he could not bring himself to do either. He was trapped by his love, unable to stay and unable to go. The tragedy of Lancelot is that he was genuinely good in every other respect. He was brave and generous and kind. He helped countless people and never asked for anything in return. He upheld the ideals of chivalry more faithfully than almost anyone else. But this one flaw, this one weakness, would undo everything. When the affair was finally exposed, as we will discuss in a later chapter, Lancelot was forced to make impossible choices. He had to choose between his love for Guinevere and his loyalty to Arthur. He had to choose between saving the woman he loved and destroying the fellowship he had helped build. There was no good option, no way to emerge with his honour intact. Lancelot chose Guinevere. He always chose Guinevere. When she was condemned to death for adultery, he rode to her rescue, killing knights who had once been his brothers in arms. When Arthur pursued him, he fled to France, taking Guinevere with him. When war came, he fought against the king he had served for so many years. But even in rebellion, Lancelot could not bring himself to harm Arthur. When they met in battle, Lancelot refused to strike the killing blow. He still loved his king, even as he betrayed him. The conflict tore him apart, leaving him a broken man even in victory. After Arthur's death, Lancelot returned to Britain, hoping to see Guinevere one last time. But she had taken religious vows, retiring to a convent to spend her remaining days in prayer and penance. When Lancelot found her, she refused to see him. She told him through the convent door that their love had brought nothing but destruction. She told him to go away and seek his own salvation. Lancelot obeyed. He became a hermit, living in a small chapel in the wilderness. He fasted and prayed, seeking forgiveness for his sins. The greatest knight in the world, who had once worn shining armour and wielded a mighty sword, now wore rough robes and spent his days on his knees. When word came that Guinevere had died, Lancelot walked to the convent to bury her. He carried her body to Glastonbury, where Arthur was also buried, and laid her beside her husband. Then he returned to his hermitage and refused all food and drink. Within 6 weeks, Lancelot was dead. His fellow hermits found him lying peacefully in his bed, a smile on his face. They said that when they buried him, the sweetest smell rose from his grave, as if all the flowers in the world had bloomed at once. It was a sign, they believed, that despite everything, Lancelot had found forgiveness. The story of Lancelot is a tragedy, but it is also a story of love that transcended all boundaries. He loved Guinevere with a completeness that most people never experience. He loved Arthur with a loyalty that survived even betrayal. He loved the ideals of Camelot so much that he dedicated his life to upholding them, even as his own actions undermined them. Lancelot was not a perfect knight. That title belongs to his son Galahad. But Lancelot was something perhaps more interesting. He was a great knight who was also deeply flawed, a hero who was also a sinner, a man who reached for the stars even as he stumbled in the mud. His story reminds us that human beings are complicated. We can be capable of tremendous good and tremendous harm at the same time. We can love deeply and still hurt the ones we love. We can strive for virtue and still fall short. But Lancelot's story also reminds us that redemption is possible. No matter how far we fall, we can always seek forgiveness. No matter how great our sins, grace is available to those who truly repent. Lancelot found peace in the end, not through his sword or his strength, but through humility and prayer. He was the greatest knight who ever lived, and he was also the most human. Of all the adventures undertaken by the Knights of the Round Table, none was greater or more significant than the quest for the Holy Grail. This was the supreme test, the ultimate challenge, the journey that would reveal the true worth of every knight who undertook it. It was also the beginning of the end for Camelot, for the quest would scatter the fellowship and leave the Round Table forever diminished. But what was the Holy Grail? Why was it so important? To understand the quest, we must first understand the object that inspired it. The Grail was the cup used by Jesus Christ at the Last Supper, the final meal he shared with his disciples before his crucifixion. According to legend, Joseph of Arimathea, the wealthy man who provided the tomb for Christ's burial, took possession of this cup. When Christ was on the cross, Joseph used the cup to catch some of his blood. After the crucifixion, Joseph was imprisoned for his faith. He spent many years in a dark cell, sustained only by the miraculous power of the Grail. The cup provided him with food and drink and light, keeping him alive when he should have died. When Joseph was finally released, he became a wanderer, carrying the Grail with him as he travelled. Eventually, he came to Britain, bringing Christianity to the island long before it was officially converted. He established a church at Glastonbury, where he planted his staff in the ground. The staff took root and became a thorn tree that bloomed every Christmas, a miracle that continued for centuries. The Grail passed from Joseph to his descendants, who became its guardians. They built a castle to house it, a place called Corbenic, or the Castle of the Fisher King. There the Grail remained, hidden from the world, waiting for the knight who was pure enough to unlock its mysteries. The Grail had miraculous powers. It could heal any wound, cure any disease, provide any food. It glowed with a holy light that filled all who saw it with joy and peace. To be in the presence of the Grail was to experience a taste of heaven itself. But the Grail was not easily approached. It was guarded by tests and trials that only the worthy could pass. Those who were sinful or impure could not even see it clearly. They might catch a glimpse, a flash of light, but the full vision was denied them. The quest for the Holy Grail began on the Feast of Pentecost, when all the knights of the Round Table were gathered at Camelot. It was a day of celebration, with feasting and music and joy. Arthur sat at the head of his table, surrounded by his champions, proud of all they had accomplished. Then something miraculous happened. The doors of the great hall flew open, though no wind was blowing. A light appeared, brighter than the sun, filling the hall with radiance. In the midst of this light, the knights could see a cup, covered with white cloth, floating through the air. It passed before each of them, and as it passed, the tables were filled with the finest food and drink, each knight receiving whatever he most desired. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the Grail vanished. The light faded, the doors closed. The knights sat in stunned silence, trying to understand what they had witnessed. Sir Gawain was the first to speak. He rose from his seat and made a vow. He swore that he would go in search of the Holy Grail and would not return to Camelot until he had seen it clearly, without the covering that had hidden it from view. One by one, the other knights rose and made the same vow. They would seek the Grail. They would prove themselves worthy. They would not rest until they had achieved this greatest of all quests. Arthur watched with a heavy heart. He knew that this quest would change everything. He knew that many of his knights would never return. He knew that the fellowship of the Round Table, which had taken so long to build, would be scattered and perhaps destroyed. But he could not forbid the quest. The Grail was the holiest of all relics. To seek it was the highest calling a knight could answer. Arthur gave his blessing, even as tears streamed down his face. The next morning, the knights rode out from Camelot, each taking a different path into the wilderness. They scattered across Britain and beyond, following signs and visions, seeking the castle where the Grail was hidden. The quest was long and difficult. Most of the knights failed. They encountered trials that tested their courage, their faith, and their purity. They faced temptations that revealed their hidden weaknesses. They fought battles against enemies, both physical and spiritual. Some knights died during the quest, slain by monsters or villains, or simply lost in the wilderness. Others gave up and returned to Camelot, ashamed of their failure, but unable to continue. Still others achieved partial success, catching glimpses of the Grail, but unable to approach it fully. Sir Gawain, despite being one of the greatest warriors at Camelot, failed the quest completely. His sins were too great, his heart too worldly. He had killed too many men, loved too many women, pursued glory too eagerly. The Grail remained hidden from him no matter how hard he searched. Sir Lancelot came closer than Gawain, but still fell short. He reached the castle of Corbenic and saw the Grail with his own eyes. But when he tried to approach it, he was struck down by an invisible force. He lay unconscious for 24 days, hovering between life and death. When Lancelot awoke, he understood why he had failed. His love for Guinevere had corrupted his soul. No matter how many good deeds he performed, no matter how bravely he fought, he could not achieve the Grail while his heart belonged to another man's wife. The quest revealed the truth that Lancelot had always known, but tried to ignore. Lancelot returned to Camelot a changed man. He had seen the limits of his own virtue. He had learned that there were heights he could never reach, no matter how hard he tried. The experience humbled him, but it did not change his behaviour. He still loved Guinevere. He still could not give her up. Only 3 knights achieved the Grail quest fully. They were Galahad, Percival and Bors. Sir Galahad was the leader of this holy trio. From the moment he sat in the Siege Perilous, everyone knew he was destined for the Grail. His purity was absolute. He had never sinned, never been tempted, never wavered from the path of righteousness. He was the perfect knight, the one the Grail had been waiting for. Galahad's journey to the Grail was marked by miracles. He healed the sick with a touch. He defeated evil knights without drawing blood. He passed through dangers that would have destroyed any other man. The Grail seemed to call to him, guiding his steps, leading him ever closer. Sir Percival was the second of the successful questers. We have already spoken of his humble origins, how he grew up in ignorance of knighthood and came to Camelot as a naive young man. That innocence which had once made him a figure of fun now proved to be his greatest asset. Percival's heart was pure because he had never learned to be cynical or corrupt. Percival faced many trials during the quest. He was tempted by beautiful women who tried to seduce him. He was deceived by demons disguised as holy men. He was tested again and again, and each time he emerged stronger and more worthy. Sir Bors was the third successful quester. Unlike Galahad and Percival, Bors was not perfectly pure. He had sinned in his youth, fathering an illegitimate child, but he had repented sincerely and spent the rest of his life trying to make amends. His faith was deep and genuine, tested by years of struggle. Bors faced perhaps the hardest trial of all. He was forced to choose between saving his brother, who was being beaten by enemies, and saving a maiden who was about to be violated. He could not save both. He had to decide which life was more important. Bors chose to save the maiden, trusting that God would protect his brother. It was an agonizing decision, one that tormented him for the rest of his life. But it was the right decision, and it proved his worthiness to approach the Grail. The 3 knights came together at the castle of Corbenic. There they found the Grail, uncovered now, shining with a light that filled them with indescribable joy. They participated in a holy ceremony, receiving communion from the hands of Christ himself, who appeared to them in a vision. Then the Grail spoke to them, or rather, a voice spoke from within the Grail. It told them to take the holy cup and carry it away from Britain. The land was no longer worthy to house such a sacred relic. Too much sin had corrupted it. The Grail must go to a holier place. Galahad, Percival, and Bors obeyed. They took the Grail and sailed across the sea to the city of Sarras, a holy city in the east. There they were welcomed as honoured guests. The king of Sarras died shortly after their arrival, and the people chose Galahad to be their new king. Galahad ruled Sarras for a year. Then, on the anniversary of his coronation, he prayed before the Grail one last time. As he prayed, his soul left his body and ascended to heaven. He had achieved the ultimate goal, union with God. The Grail went with him, rising into the sky and vanishing from the mortal world forever. Percival, grief-stricken at the loss of his friend, retired to a hermitage. He spent his remaining days in prayer and contemplation. Within a year, he too was dead, his pure soul departing for heaven. Only Bors returned to Camelot. He came back alone, bearing the sad news of what had happened. The Grail was gone. Galahad and Percival were dead. The quest was over. Arthur received this news with mixed emotions. He was glad that the quest had been achieved, that knights from his round table had proven worthy of the highest honour, but he was also devastated by the losses. So many knights had died or disappeared during the quest. The round table was half empty now, the fellowship shattered. The Grail quest marked the end of Camelot's golden age. The kingdom continued to exist, and Arthur continued to rule, but something essential had been lost. The sense of purpose that had driven the knights, the belief that they were building something glorious, had faded. The Grail had come and gone, and in its wake it left emptiness. Some scholars see the Grail quest as a symbol of the tension between earthly and spiritual values. The Knights of the Round Table had dedicated themselves to worldly goals, fighting battles, winning glory, serving their king. The Grail represented a higher calling, a reminder that there were things more important than earthly success. Most of the knights failed the Grail quest because they were too attached to worldly things. Their sins, their ambitions, their loves all held them back. Only those who had truly surrendered themselves to God could achieve the ultimate prize. But there is also a tragedy in this. The knights who achieved the Grail left the world behind. Galahad and Percival died. Even Bors, who returned, was forever changed, more focused on heaven than on earth. The quest drained Camelot of its best and brightest, leaving the kingdom weaker and more vulnerable. Perhaps this was inevitable. Perhaps the ideals of Camelot were always too high to be sustained. Perhaps the Golden Age was destined to end, and the Grail quest was simply the catalyst that set the decline in motion. Whatever the interpretation, the quest for the Holy Grail remains one of the most powerful stories in the Arthurian legends. It speaks to our deepest longings for meaning and transcendence. It reminds us that there is more to life than the material world, and it shows us both the glory and the cost of pursuing the highest ideals. The Grail is gone now, taken to heaven where it belongs, but its memory lingers, inspiring seekers and dreamers to this day. The quest continues, in one form or another, for all of us. No kingdom, no matter how glorious, is without enemies. Camelot faced threats from many directions, some external and some internal. We have already spoken of the Saxons and the rebellious kings who challenged Arthur in his early years. Now we must turn to the enemies who struck from the shadows, the schemers and plotters who sought to destroy Arthur through treachery rather than open warfare. Chief among these was Morgan le Fay, a figure of mystery and power whose relationship with Arthur was as complicated as any in the legends. Morgan was Arthur's half-sister, the daughter of Igraine and her first husband, the Duke of Cornwall. She was already a young woman when Arthur was born, and she watched from the sidelines as her mother's new husband, Uther Pendragon, took the throne that might have been her father's. Did Morgan resent Arthur from the beginning? Did she blame him for the circumstances of his conception, the magical deception that had led to her father's death? The legends are not entirely clear on this point. Some versions portray Morgan as hostile to Arthur from childhood. Others suggest that she loved her brother at first and only turned against him later. What is clear is that Morgan possessed extraordinary magical abilities. She was sent to a convent as a young girl, but she did not learn only prayers and needlework there. She studied the old arts, the forbidden knowledge that had been passed down from the Druids and the priestesses of the ancient religion. She became a sorceress of tremendous power, rivaling even Merlin in her command of magic. Morgan's title, Le Fay, means the fairy. It marked her as someone connected to the other world, to the realm of spirits and enchantments that existed alongside the mortal world. She could change her shape, taking on any form she wished. She could cast illusions that fooled even the wisest. She could brew potions that healed or harmed, that inspired love or induced sleep. She was dangerous in ways that ordinary enemies were not. At some point, Morgan married King Uriens of Gore, one of the rulers who had initially rebelled against Arthur, but later made peace. This marriage should have bound Morgan more closely to Camelot. Instead, it seemed to fuel her resentment. She was a queen now, but a lesser queen, subordinate to Guinevere and to her brother's authority. Morgan's hatred of Arthur manifested in many schemes and plots. She tried repeatedly to kill him or destroy his kingdom. She used her magic to create obstacles and dangers. She manipulated others into doing her bidding, turning friends into enemies and allies into traitors. One of Morgan's most famous schemes involved the theft of Excalibur's scabbard. We have already mentioned how important this scabbard was. As long as Arthur wore it, he could not be killed by wounds in battle. The scabbard was his greatest protection, more valuable even than the magical sword itself. Morgan managed to steal the scabbard while Arthur was sleeping. She replaced it with an exact copy, so perfect that Arthur did not notice the switch. Then she fled, taking the real scabbard with her. When Arthur discovered the theft, he pursued Morgan with a company of knights. She fled across the countryside, staying just ahead of her pursuers. When she reached a lake, she knew she could not escape. Rather than let Arthur recover the scabbard, she threw it into the water, where it sank beyond any hope of recovery. Then Morgan used her magic to transform herself and her followers into stones. When Arthur arrived, he found only a circle of standing stones where his sister had been. He searched everywhere, but could not find her. Morgan had escaped, and the scabbard was lost forever. This loss would have fatal consequences. Without the scabbard's protection, Arthur was vulnerable to mortal wounds. The injury he would receive at the Battle of Camlan, the wound that would eventually kill him, might have been survivable if he had still possessed the scabbard. Morgan's theft, in a sense, sealed Arthur's doom years before his final battle. But Morgan's relationship with Arthur was not purely antagonistic. In some versions of the legends, she appears at crucial moments to help him rather than harm him. When Arthur lay dying after Camlan, it was Morgan who came to carry him away to Avalon. She was one of the queens on the barge that bore him across the water to the mystical island where he would be healed. This suggests that Morgan's feelings toward Arthur were complicated. She resented him, perhaps even hated him at times, but she also loved him as a brother. Her schemes against him may have been driven by jealousy or ambition rather than true malice. And in the end, when everything else had failed, she was there to save him. Morgan Le Fay represents the ambiguity that runs through so many of the Arthurian legends. She is neither purely good nor purely evil. She is a complex figure whose motivations are not always clear. She reminds us that the enemies we face are often not monsters but people, with their own reasons and their own pain. But Morgan was not Arthur's only enemy from within his own family. There was also Mordred, whose story is perhaps the darkest in all the legends. Mordred was Arthur's son, but the circumstances of his conception were shameful. In his youth, before he knew the truth of his parentage, Arthur had an affair with a woman named Morgause. Morgause was the wife of King Lot, the mother of Gawain and his brothers. She was also Arthur's half-sister, another daughter of Igraine from her first marriage. Arthur did not know that Morgause was his sister when he lay with her. The truth of his parentage had been hidden from him. He thought she was simply a beautiful woman, and he was young and foolish and gave in to temptation. When Arthur learned the truth, he was horrified. He had committed incest, one of the gravest sins imaginable, and worse, Morgause was pregnant. A child had been conceived from this unholy union. Merlin warned Arthur that this child would be his doom. The boy would grow up to destroy everything Arthur had built. He would bring about the fall of Camelot and the death of the king himself. Arthur, in his desperation, did something terrible. He ordered that all the babies born around the time of Mordred's birth be gathered and placed on a ship. Then he had the ship set adrift, hoping that it would sink and the cursed child would drown. The ship did sink, but Mordred survived. He was washed ashore and found by a fisherman, who raised him until his true identity was discovered. Eventually, Mordred came to Camelot, and Arthur, unable to kill his own son directly, accepted him into the court. This was a mistake, perhaps the greatest mistake Arthur ever made. By keeping Mordred close, he gave his enemy access to all the secrets and weaknesses of Camelot. Mordred learned how the kingdom worked. He identified the fractures and tensions that could be exploited. He waited patiently for his opportunity. Mordred was handsome and charming when he wanted to be. He could be pleasant and agreeable, winning the trust of those around him. But beneath the surface he was cold and calculating. He hated Arthur for trying to kill him as a baby. He resented being a bastard, denied the inheritance that should have been his. He wanted revenge, and he wanted power. Mordred found allies among those who had grievances against Arthur. There were always discontented nobles, men who felt they had been slighted or overlooked. There were enemies of Lancelot who resented the great knight's prominence. There were those who disapproved of Guinevere and whispered about her relationship with Lancelot. Mordred cultivated these malcontents, building a network of supporters who would help him when the time came. He was patient, willing to wait years for the right moment. He knew that Arthur's reign could not last forever, and he intended to be ready when it ended. The opportunity Mordred had been waiting for came from an unexpected direction. It came from the exposure of Lancelot and Guinevere's affair. Mordred was one of those who had long suspected the truth about the Queen and her champion. He watched them carefully, noting the glances and touches that betrayed their feelings. He gathered evidence, waiting for the moment when he could use it to maximum effect. That moment came when Arthur was away from Camelot. Mordred, along with a group of knights, including his brother Agravain, confronted Lancelot in the Queen's chambers. They caught the lovers together, proving beyond doubt what many had long suspected. What happened next would tear Camelot apart, but that is a story for our final chapter, the story of the fall of Camelot and the death of Arthur. Before we leave this chapter, we should mention some of the other enemies who threatened Arthur during his reign. There were giants and monsters, remnants of an older world that Arthur and his knights had to defeat. There were wicked knights who preyed on the innocent and had to be brought to justice. There were foreign invaders who saw Britain's wealth and wanted to take it for themselves. But the greatest enemies were always those closest to home. Morgan Le Fay, with her magic and her schemes. Mordred, with his patience and his hate. The weaknesses within Arthur's own court. The jealousies and resentments that festered beneath the surface. Camelot was a dream of perfection, but it was built by imperfect people, And in the end, it was those imperfections that brought it down. We have come at last to the end of our story, the final chapter in the legend of King Arthur. It is a sad chapter, full of betrayal and loss and death, but it is also a chapter of courage and nobility, of heroes facing their doom with dignity and grace. The fall of Camelot was a tragedy, but it was a tragedy worthy of the greatness that preceded it. The beginning of the end came with the exposure of Lancelot and Guinevere's affair. For years the secret had been kept, known to some but never spoken openly. Arthur may have suspected the truth, but he had chosen not to see it. The kingdom had been held together by a web of polite fictions and wilful blindness. Mordred and Agravain tore that web apart. They came to Arthur and told him plainly what they knew. The Queen was unfaithful, Lancelot was a traitor, the greatest knight in the world had been betraying his king for years. Arthur did not want to believe it. He loved both Guinevere and Lancelot. He could not bear to think that they had deceived him so completely. But he was also a king bound by laws and duties. He could not ignore a direct accusation of treason. Arthur told Mordred and Agravain that if they wanted to prove their claims, they would have to catch the lovers together. He gave them permission to set a trap, though his heart was heavy as he did so. Perhaps he hoped they would fail. Perhaps he hoped the accusations would prove false. But he knew, deep down, that the truth was about to come out. Arthur announced that he was going hunting and would be away from Camelot for the night. This was the opportunity Mordred and Agravain had been waiting for. They knew that Lancelot would visit Guinevere when the king was gone. They gathered a group of knights, 12 in all, and hid near the queen's chambers, waiting. That night Lancelot came to Guinevere as expected. He was unarmed, wearing only a robe, expecting a private evening with the woman he loved. He had no idea that enemies were waiting just outside the door. Mordred and his knights burst in, catching Lancelot and Guinevere together. There could be no denial now, no pretense of innocence. The trap had sprung. But Lancelot was still the greatest warrior in the world, even unarmed and unprepared. When the knights rushed at him, he grabbed a stool and used it as a weapon, striking down the first attacker. He took the fallen knight's sword and began to fight. The battle was fierce but brief. Lancelot killed Agravain and most of the other knights. Only Mordred escaped, fleeing into the night to bring word of what had happened. Lancelot, wounded but alive, knew that he had to flee. He could not stay at Camelot now. Everything had changed. He wanted to take Guinevere with him, but she refused. She told him to go, to save himself. She would face whatever punishment awaited her. She would not run like a criminal. Lancelot fled into the darkness, gathering his loyal followers as he went. By morning he was gone from Camelot, riding hard for the coast where ships could carry him to safety. Guinevere was arrested and brought before Arthur. The king's heart was breaking, but he had no choice. The law was clear. Adultery by a queen was treason, and the punishment for treason was death. Guinevere was condemned to be burned at the stake. The sentence shocked many at Camelot. Guinevere had been a good queen, beloved by the people. Even those who had suspected her affair with Lancelot did not want to see her die. Knights who had sworn to protect women were now being asked to watch one burn. It went against everything they believed in. Gawain refused to participate in the execution. He loved Guinevere and could not bear to see her harmed. His brothers Gaheris and Gareth felt the same way. They went to the execution unarmed, as a sign of protest, standing in the crowd rather than serving as guards. Arthur secretly hoped that Lancelot would come to rescue Guinevere. He did not want his wife to die. He wanted someone to save her, to take the choice out of his hands. And he knew that Lancelot would never let the woman he loved be burned alive. He was right. As Guinevere was led to the stake, as the flames were being prepared, Lancelot appeared with a company of armed knights. They charged into the crowd, cutting down anyone who stood in their way. In the chaos and confusion, Lancelot reached Guinevere and swept her onto his horse. Then he rode away, carrying her to safety. But the rescue came at a terrible cost. In the fighting, Lancelot's knights killed many men, including Gaheris and Gareth. These two brothers had been unarmed and had not resisted. They were cut down by accident, victims of the chaos rather than deliberate targets. When Gawain learned that his brothers were dead, killed by Lancelot's men, his grief turned to rage. He had loved Lancelot once. He had considered him a friend and brother. But now that friendship was drowned in blood. Gawain went to Arthur and demanded vengeance. He swore that he would never rest until Lancelot was dead. He begged the king to make war on the man who had killed his brothers. Arthur was torn. He did not want to fight Lancelot. Despite everything, he still loved the knight who had served him so faithfully for so many years. He knew that Lancelot had not meant to kill Gaheris and Gareth. He knew that the whole tragic situation was the result of circumstances spiralling out of control. But Gawain would not be denied. He was Arthur's nephew, one of his most important supporters. His grief was genuine, his anger justified. Arthur could not refuse him without losing his loyalty, and perhaps sparking a civil war within his own ranks. And so Arthur gathered his army and marched against Lancelot. Lancelot had fled to his castle of Joyous Gard, a mighty fortress that he had won years before through his valour. He had taken Guinevere there, along with all the knights who remained loyal to him. He prepared for a siege, hoping that somehow the conflict could be resolved without more bloodshed. Arthur's army surrounded Joyous Gard. The siege lasted for months. There were skirmishes and battles, but no decisive engagement. Lancelot refused to fight Arthur directly. Whenever the king appeared on the battlefield, Lancelot withdrew. He could not bring himself to raise his sword against the man he had served for so long. Arthur, for his part, was half-hearted in his attacks. He did not really want to defeat Lancelot. He wanted the whole nightmare to end. He wanted to go back to the way things had been before, when Camelot was golden and his knights were united. But there was no going back. Too much had happened. Too much blood had been spilled. Eventually, the Pope intervened. He sent a legate to Britain, commanding Arthur to take Guinevere back and make peace with Lancelot. The Pope threatened to place all of Britain under interdict if the king refused, which would mean no masses, no sacraments, no Christian rites of any kind. Arthur agreed to the Pope's terms. He was relieved to have an excuse to end the war. Guinevere was returned to him, and he received her with as much grace as he could muster. Lancelot was allowed to leave Britain in peace, sailing across the sea to his ancestral lands in France. But Gawain was not satisfied. He still burned for revenge. He convinced Arthur that they must pursue Lancelot to France and finish what they had started. The king, unable to refuse his nephew, agreed. Arthur left Mordred in charge of Britain while he was away. This was the worst decision he could have made. He was leaving his kingdom in the hands of his greatest enemy, the son who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. The war in France dragged on. Arthur besieged Lancelot's castle of Benwick, just as he had besieged Joyous Gard. Gawain challenged Lancelot to single combat, again and again, and each time Lancelot defeated him, but refused to kill him. The great knight still loved Gawain, still remembered the friendship they had once shared. In their final duel, Gawain was gravely wounded. Lancelot struck him on the head, reopening an old wound that had never fully healed. Gawain fell and could not rise. Lancelot stood over him, sword raised, but he could not deliver the killing blow. He walked away, leaving Gawain to be carried from the field by his men. Gawain would never fully recover from this wound. He lingered for weeks, growing weaker and weaker, and during this time, terrible news arrived from Britain. Mordred had seized the throne. As soon as Arthur had sailed for France, Mordred had begun to put his long-planned scheme into action. He spread rumours that Arthur was dead, killed in the war against Lancelot. He produced forged letters confirming the king's death. He called a council of nobles and convinced them to crown him as Arthur's successor. Then Mordred did something even more shocking. He announced that he would marry Guinevere, making her his queen. This would legitimize his claim to the throne and give him control over Arthur's household. Guinevere was horrified. She despised Mordred and knew exactly what kind of man he was. She refused to marry him, barricading herself in the Tower of London with loyal guards. Mordred besieged the tower, but Guinevere held out, buying time and hoping for rescue. When Arthur received word of Mordred's treachery, he immediately broke off the siege of Benwick and sailed for home. The war with Lancelot was forgotten. A greater enemy threatened everything he had built. Gawain, though dying, insisted on accompanying the king. He would not let Arthur face Mordred alone. He dictated a letter to Lancelot, apologising for his anger and asking the great knight to come to Britain and help Arthur in his hour of need. Then he prepared for his final journey. Arthur's fleet landed at Dover, where Mordred's forces were waiting. A great battle erupted on the beaches, with Arthur's loyal knights fighting against the traitors who had joined Mordred. The fighting was fierce and bloody, with heavy losses on both sides. During the battle, Gawain received another blow to his wounded head. This time, the injury was fatal. He was carried to a tent, where he lay dying as the battle raged around him. Arthur came to his nephew's side. Gawain, with his last breaths, told the king that he forgave Lancelot for everything. He said that his own pride and anger had brought them to this pass. He begged Arthur to send for Lancelot, to make peace with him before it was too late. Then Gawain died, one of the greatest knights of the Round Table, brought low by his own thirst for vengeance. Arthur mourned his nephew, but he had no time for grief. Mordred had retreated inland, gathering more forces. The final confrontation was yet to come. The two armies met at a place called Camlan. The chronicles do not agree on exactly where this was. Some say it was in Cornwall, others say it was in Wales or in the north, but all agree on what happened there. It was the bloodiest battle in the history of Britain. Arthur's loyal knights fought against Mordred's rebels and Saxon mercenaries. The fighting lasted all day, from dawn until dusk. By the time the sun began to set, the field was covered with the bodies of the dead and dying. Almost all the knights of the Round Table fell at Camlan. Brave warriors who had survived countless battles, who had faced monsters and villains and foreign invaders, met their end on this terrible day. The fellowship that Arthur had spent his life building was destroyed in a single afternoon. As evening approached, Arthur looked around the battlefield and saw that almost everyone was dead. Only a handful of his knights remained standing. On the other side, Mordred still lived, surrounded by a small group of followers. Arthur's heart was filled with rage and grief. He had lost everything. His kingdom, his knights, his dream of Camelot, all of it was gone, destroyed by his own son's treachery. He saw Mordred standing across the field, and he knew what he had to do. Arthur took up a spear and charged at his son. Mordred saw him coming and braced himself. They met in the middle of the field, two figures silhouetted against the setting sun. Arthur drove his spear through Mordred's body, a fatal wound that no man could survive. But Mordred, with his last strength, pulled himself along the spear shaft until he was close enough to strike. He swung his sword and hit Arthur on the head, cutting through the king's helmet and into his skull. Both men fell. Mordred died there on the field, his treachery finally punished. But Arthur still lived, though barely. The wound was grievous, perhaps mortal. He lay on the bloody ground, too weak to move. Sir Bedivere, one of the few knights who had survived the battle, found the king and knelt beside him. Arthur was fading fast. He knew that death was near. The king gave Bedivere one final command. He told him to take Excalibur and throw it into a nearby lake. The sword had been given to Arthur by the Lady of the Lake, and now it must be returned to her. Bedivere took the sword and walked to the lake, but when he looked at Excalibur, at its beautiful blade and jewelled hilt, he could not bring himself to throw it away. Such a magnificent weapon should not be lost. He hid the sword under a bush and returned to Arthur. The king asked him what he had seen when the sword entered the water. Bedivere, caught in his lie, said he had seen nothing but waves and wind. Arthur knew that Bedivere had not obeyed. He commanded him again to throw the sword into the lake. Bedivere went back, but again he could not do it. Again he hid the sword and returned with a false report. Arthur was angry now. He told Bedivere that if he did not obey this time, the king would rise and kill him with his own hands, wounded as he was. Bedivere went to the lake a third time. This time he closed his eyes and threw Excalibur as far as he could. The sword spun through the air, flashing in the last light of day. And then a miracle happened. A hand rose from the water, a woman's hand clothed in white. It caught Excalibur by the hilt, brandished it 3 times, and then drew it beneath the surface. The sword was gone, returned to the Lady of the Lake. Bedivere ran back to Arthur and told him what he had seen. The king nodded, satisfied. It was done. Then Arthur asked Bedivere to carry him to the shore of the lake. The knight lifted his king, though Arthur was heavy and Bedivere was exhausted, and carried him to the water's edge. A barge was waiting there, appearing as if from nowhere. It was draped in black cloth, and on it sat 3 queens, all dressed in mourning. One of them was Morgan le Fay, Arthur's sister, who had been his enemy for so long, but who had come now to save him. The queens helped Arthur onto the barge. They laid him down gently, his head resting in Morgan's lap. The barge began to move, gliding across the water without oars or sails, heading toward the west where the sun had set. Bedivere called out, asking where they were taking the king. Arthur's voice came back across the water, faint but clear. He said he was going to Avalon, the island of the blessed, where his wounds would be healed. He told Bedivere to pray for him and to tell the people of Britain that their king would return some day. When the land needed him most, when darkness threatened to overwhelm the light, Arthur would come back to save his people. Then the barge disappeared into the mist and Arthur was gone. Bedivere stood on the shore for a long time, watching the place where the barge had vanished. He was the last of the Knights of the Round Table, the sole survivor of the fellowship that had once been the glory of Britain. The weight of all that loss pressed down on him, and he wept. But he also remembered Arthur's words. The king would return. Camelot might have fallen, but the dream it represented could never truly die. Some day, when the world was ready, Arthur would come again. This is why Arthur is called the once and future king. He ruled once in the golden age of Camelot, and he will rule again in some future time when his presence is needed. He sleeps in Avalon, healing from his wounds, waiting for the call that will summon him back to the world. Some say that Avalon is a real place, hidden somewhere in the mists of the Western Sea. Others say it is a symbol, a representation of the hope that never dies. But all agree that Arthur's story does not end with his death. It continues, stretching forward into a future that has not yet arrived. After Arthur's departure, Britain fell into chaos once more. The Saxons, seeing that the great king was gone, renewed their attacks. The unity that Arthur had forged crumbled without his leadership. The petty kings returned to their squabbling, and the dream of a united Britain faded. Guinevere, as we have mentioned, retired to a convent. She spent her remaining years in prayer and penance, seeking forgiveness for the sins that had contributed to Camelot's fall. When she died, she was buried at Glastonbury, beside the grave that was said to hold Arthur's body. Lancelot came back to Britain when he received Gawain's letter, but he arrived too late. The Battle of Camlan was already over. Arthur was gone. Guinevere had taken her vows. There was nothing left for him. Lancelot visited Guinevere's convent one last time, hoping to see her, but she refused to meet with him. She sent word that their love had brought destruction to everyone they cared about. She told him to go away and seek his own salvation. Lancelot obeyed. He became a hermit, living in a small chapel in the wilderness. He fasted and prayed, wearing rough robes instead of shining armour. The greatest knight in the world ended his days as a humble penitent. When Guinevere died, Lancelot walked to the convent to bury her. He carried her body to Glastonbury and laid her in the grave beside Arthur. Then he returned to his hermitage and refused all food and drink. And so the legend of King Arthur continues to this day. We still tell stories about the boy who pulled a sword from a stone and became the greatest king Britain has ever known. We still dream of Camelot, that shining city on a hill where knights in armour rode out to right wrongs and defend the innocent. We still wait, in some corner of our hearts, for the once and future king to return. Perhaps he will. Perhaps some day, when the world needs him most, Arthur will wake from his long sleep in Avalon. He will take up Excalibur once more and ride forth to save his people. The Round Table will be restored. The fellowship will be renewed, and the Golden Age will come again. Until that day, we have the stories, we have the legends, we have the memory of what Camelot represented and the hope that it inspired. And that perhaps is enough. For as long as we remember Arthur, as long as we tell his story and dream his dream, he is not truly gone. He lives in our imagination, in our aspirations, in our belief that the world can be better than it is. The king is dead, long live the king. And so we come to the end of our journey through the legend of King Arthur. We have travelled from the dark days before his birth, through his miraculous rise to power, through the glory of Camelot and the tragedy of its fall. We have met wizards and warriors, queens and enchantresses, heroes and villains. We have witnessed love and betrayal, triumph and disaster. It has been a long tale, full of wonder and sorrow, but it is a tale worth telling and worth hearing, for in the story of Arthur we see ourselves reflected. We see our own struggles and hopes, our own failures and redemptions. We see what we might become if we dare to dream of something greater. Within 6 weeks Lancelot was dead. His fellow hermits buried him with honour, and they said that the sweetest smell rose from his grave, a sign that despite everything, he had found peace at last. The Round Table, that great symbol of equality and fellowship, was broken. The knights who had sat around it were dead or scattered. The code of chivalry they had upheld survived only in stories and songs. But those stories and songs proved more enduring than any kingdom. The legend of King Arthur spread throughout Britain and then throughout Europe. Bards and poets told and retold the tales, adding new details and new adventures. The story grew and changed, but its core remained the same. Arthur represented something that people needed to believe in. He represented the possibility of justice in an unjust world. He represented courage in the face of overwhelming odds. He represented the dream of a better society, where the strong protected the weak and honour meant more than power. That dream did not die with Arthur. It lived on in the hearts of those who heard his story. It inspired kings and commoners alike to strive for something higher than mere survival. It gave people hope that the darkness would not last forever, that someday the light would return.